Hey, this is Cedric Youngelman, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. In today's episode with Seb Bunny, we discuss his phenomenal new book, The Hidden Cost of Money. So if you're looking for a conversation that breaks down how money impacts our relationships, politics, planet, and authoritarianism, then this is it. And it's brought to you by Alpa Energy Bars, a new kind of energy bar. Live life untamed. Question everything. If you don't believe everything you're told, break the rules, strive for freedom, reach for your peak, and don't follow the mainstream, then you're one of us. We question everything, including what real health is. Alpa bars are made with high quality Colorado grass fed beef, American sourced fruits and nuts, and nutrient rich beef tallow, so they make for a great pick me up. When I find myself caught in the fiat matrix, I'm thankful I can pull out an Alpa Premium Energy meat bar to get some much needed fuel for the burn. I can't think of a better snack meal replacement. The Chad of energy bars, challenging the norm and supporting freedom. Go to eatalpa.com, EATAUPA.com now and use the code MATRIX for a discount off your purchase of Alpa Premium Energy meat bars. When friends and family ask me, where's the best place to buy Bitcoin, I always send them to River because River is the Bitcoin exchange of choice for the long-term investor. Securely buy Bitcoin at the tightest spreads in the industry. Have peace of mind thanks to their 100% full reserve cold storage custody and enjoy zero fees on recurring orders. River built and owns their own infrastructure. Your Bitcoin is your Bitcoin to withdraw at any time. And I suggest that if you have not done so already, that you learn how to do so and do it immediately. If you need help getting started or have questions, River has US-based phone support for all clients. And River just launched a new product called RiverLink, allowing you to send Bitcoin over a text message that you can claim to any wallet. Give a gift, pay a friend for dinner, or orange pill your friends in the easiest way possible. Use my referral link in the show notes to get started and earn up to $100 in free Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin deserves the best protection. With Thea, you're in charge. No more fears of losing your keys or falling prey to hackers. Their self custody multi sig vaults empowers you to be the ultimate guardian of your Bitcoin. I downloaded the app over the weekend and set up a multi sig rig in minutes. And Thea has been one of the best ways not just to orange pill my wife, but it's never been easier to get her to interact with Bitcoin through Thea. This is revolutionary technology, and Thea makes it so user friendly, intuitive, comfortable, and most importantly, secure. But I really like what Thea is doing to make Bitcoin multi sig so easy. Share the power of secure Bitcoin with your loved ones. Thea enables shared custody, making it a family friendly choice for safeguarding your digital legacy. And for those unexpected moments, Thea's got your back. Their multi device vaults with both assisted and sovereign recovery options mean your Bitcoin is safe, always accessible, and ready for the future. Thea is more than just an app, it's your partner in the Bitcoin journey with 24/7 support from a team that cares. Download Thea now using the link in the show notes and get your first 6 months free and experience the new standard in Bitcoin multi sig security. I can't tell you how excited I am to join the Bitcoin Advisor. Honestly, it's been amazing to get on the Zoom calls with listeners, hear your concerns, and solve your issues by helping you set up your multi-sigs and secure your Bitcoin for decades to come, while ensuring you can sleep at night with the right estate planning and asset protection strategies to make sure your Bitcoin is safe for you and your family and loved ones. My goal is to help you get your Bitcoin off exchanges, simplify the process, address your Bitcoin challenges, and ensure you feel confident every step of the way. If you or someone you know needs help buying Bitcoin and creating a multi sig vault, I'm here to help. Ready to dive in and learn more? Simply head over to the bitcoinadvisor.com/Cedric and book some time on my calendar. I'm more than happy to hop on a call and see how I can help. Hodler's Official is the team Bitcoin merch and memorabilia company for Bitcoin's biggest fans. Great Christmas gift idea for your friends and family that love Bitcoin. They also do custom specifically for Bitcoin companies. Go to hodlersofficial.com today and get your Team Bitcoin gear. Use code MATRIX for 10% off your entire purchase. Link in the show notes. The Bitcoin Matrix has proudly partnered with Circle 6 Ranch, the Beef Initiative, and Bitcoin Bay to offer you a taste of Black Angus beef that's grass-fed, antibiotic-free, and steeped in tradition. So, the Youngelman family has been struggling to get decent beef at the local supermarket, and last week here in Florida. And last week, we finally sat down to a couple of succulent ribeyes delivered to my house by the Florida Beef Initiative. And wow, did we taste the difference. And just like Thea is helping to onboard my wife to Bitcoin and multi-sig security, the Florida Beef Initiative made it clear to my family how much we need and value food, health, and energy security. And now we can get all of that through Circle 6 Ranch, Bitcoin Bay, and the Florida Beef Initiative. Discover their premium beef selections like the Florida Pasture Beef Box and join a movement that's restoring Florida's local economy one steak at a time. The Florida Beef Initiative and the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, energy secured with exceptional flavor in every succulent bite. Link for a discount can be found in the show notes. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix to explore money's deep impact on society, politics, and mental health, as well as uncover the societal consequences of monetary choices in this extremely revealing interview with Seb Bunny, a deep critical thinker that really understands complex systems.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Seb Bunny's journey into the financial world is unique among his peers. In the early stages of his career, he navigated the rugged mountains of BC, Canada as a backcountry mountain bike guide and coach. Yet, a sense of incompleteness lingered. As a result, during his spare time, he delved into the complexities of real estate, financial markets, and the fundamental structures that underpin our economy. Seizing an opportune moment during the pandemic, Seb strategically moved into the financial space, leveraging his diverse experiences for a unique perspective. Since departing the world of mountain biking, Seb has transitioned his passion for education to the digital landscape. His teachings now focus on the macroeconomic landscape, particularly the intricacies of our monetary system. Seb's commitment to supporting others on their educational journey led him to co-found the educational platform Looking Glass. Additionally, he has authored books such as B is for Bitcoin and The Hidden Cost of Money, further solidifying his dedication to knowledge sharing and financial awareness. He is always exploring the world in search of understanding. Seb, welcome back to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you, my friend?
Cedric, honestly, it's such a pleasure to be back on the show. I was just talking to Cedric before this show started, and I think Cedric was either my second or third podcast I'd ever been on. And I came on very unprepared, didn't have a mic. And I remember Cedric at the end being like, Seb, you need to get a mic. So if it wasn't for Cedric, I wouldn't be where I am. And you'd be able to hear my voice nice and crisp. So thanks a lot for having me on, Cedric. Your content is phenomenal. And yeah, I look forward to it.
I appreciate that. You were on episode 96, The Truth Behind Bitcoin's Opposition. I definitely think people should go back to that one. We talk about how Bitcoin represents a threat to the United States dollar and its global hegemony backed by endless war. What Saddam Hussein, Hugo Chavez, Gaddafi, and Bitcoin may have in common. Economic hitman jackals, the U.S. military, and behind the altruistic curtain. Why does the Federal Reserve target inflation? It was really a fantastic show, and it was great to kind of meet you early on in your journey as well. It's fun, kind of getting to know new people in the space. And I mean, it's interesting how prolific you've been since. I think you started the Looking Glass right after that. I remember Greg Faust reached out to me. He was working on some educational projects, and I remember he was kind of, I think we were even on a thread early on together. And then you wrote B is for Bitcoin. And now we work together at the Bitcoin Advisor, helping people get Bitcoin off exchanges and secure it for generations. So quite the journey there and how it's come full circle. And I'd love to talk about your book, The Hidden Cost of Money. I read it. I think I got it down to 100 pages of notes here, 100 pages of notes. It's quite in depth, and it takes a really interesting approach, to, I'd say, money's effects on us in society. So maybe what was the inspiration for writing this particular book?
You know what? It's a tough one. I would say it will make more sense if I give a little bit of clarity around kind of my journey that led me here. So, like, first off, I was a mountain bike instructor, a backcountry mountain bike instructor for about 10 years, and I absolutely loved it. But what I started to realize is I'm working my absolute ass off trying to get ahead, and life does not seem to be getting easier. And I would say that I'm quite like a motivated and driven individual. And then on top of that, I'm starting to see, and this was probably now 15 years ago, I was starting to see these idols, these people that as a kid I used to see in the mountain bike movies, these people that were world renowned, credit card debt, no assets, they were definitely renting. And I'm just like, what is going on here? Like, what is making the world so hard? And so that led me into investing, because I realized if I want to get ahead in life, I have to figure out a way to create, whether it's passive income or alternate streams of income, to be able to support the lifestyle I want to live. And that kind of led me into investing, real estate. I traded options for a long time and looked at the value investing world. And that's kind of where I found Preston Pish. And deep down that rabbit hole, it kind of leads you to gold. And then eventually I found my way to Bitcoin. And this was just before the pandemic. And it's one of those things, for so long, I thought Bitcoin is just this Ponzi. Bitcoin is this thing that I don't need to get involved in. It's speculative. And I'd seen my brother, I remember he was buying, I think he was buying weed on the Silk Road or something. And I just remember having such disdain for it. And also being a big value investor and seeing Warren Buffett badmouth it. It's really hard seeing these people that you truly idolize, that have shaped your thinking in investing, to be able to step back from these people who you think have a very broad, objective view of the world, and then to actually try and formulate your own opinion on it. And so it took me a long time to move through those hurdles. But then once you start trying to view the monetary system more objectively, you start to realize something is wrong. And that's really what led me kind of to where I am today. And so about 2.5 years ago, I founded Looking Glass Education with Greg Foss, Dasby, and a couple others. And our whole goal there was to try to create education surrounding our monetary system, financial literacy, Bitcoin, for the average individual, for the worker, so that they can actually understand what's going on. Because there's phenomenal content out there if we want to go philosophical and talk about like breed love, or if we want to go more of the technical and talk about Antonopoulos. But when it comes to, I think, speaking in kind of more simple language for the layman, I felt like there was something missing. And so that started Looking Glass. And then from that, I started to realize that there was a book missing. And that book ultimately was a more holistic approach of our monetary system, and looking at like, how does money, or why does money influence our social spheres, our relationships, our children? Why does money impact our environment? How does money impact our politics and our businesses? And ultimately, if we wanted to realign the incentives in society towards creating value, how do we do that? And so the closest thing I think I'd found prior to writing this book was probably the Bitcoin Standard or the Fiat Standard. And Saifedean's books are phenomenal, but I still felt like you could speak more to the layman about our own personal experiences. And so that definitely led me to this place. And yeah, Broken Money was another one that was phenomenal, but again, it's quite heavy. And so I wanted to kind of simplify it down, and that kind of led me to writing this book.
Well, I mean, I'm reading Saifedean's latest book, The Principles of Economics, now, where we're trying to get together our chat. We had to postpone due to a personal situation, but it's really that book is also mind-opening, and but your book is very different, very different lens, and it's not even, and that Principles of Economics is not a Bitcoin book, but this is also not a Bitcoin book, but I see this more of as almost like the psychology of money and its impact on us. Your article, which I think preceded this book, The Surprising Solution to Our Downfall in Culture and Authenticity, was the reason I reached out prior to knowing you even writing this book. And, I'm going through it, in my own life, thinking a lot about my childhood, with sort of my father's passing. And I don't think I'm middle-aged, but approaching statistically middle-aged. And also watching my own kids grow up and having them go through more the older phases of childhood now. So there's a lot of reflecting there, and just even dealing with my siblings, and then seeing my wife and her family, and dealing with my mom. So I'd love to kind of get into, a little bit more about the book, and sort of maybe what kind of insights did you draw from your childhood that led you to writing this book?
So I would say, like, when I look back at my childhood, I feel so lucky to have had the childhood that I did. But I really started to recognize that everyone's childhood is unique, and my parents separated very early on. And given that my parents separated very early on, my mum had to support myself and my two brothers. And you can start to see how, when you're supporting three kids, when you're trying to put a roof over your head, you're trying to support, get food on the table, clothes on your backs, all of a sudden, if you're just an individual trying to support that, it's incredibly challenging. And so I started to notice how I was looking to my peers for attachment rather than necessarily looking to my mum, given that my mum had to work to be able to support us. So when I start looking back at my own childhood, I start to realize how it has influenced me, given that I didn't necessarily have the emotional support that maybe I would have liked to have given to my kids. And that's not to say that I don't think my mum tried. I think my mum did such a phenomenal job, but it's because of the circumstances at which she was in. And so this is where you start to realize, when society, when money is kind of losing value over time, when money is breaking down, all of a sudden parents have to work more. And if parents have to work more, that leaves them less time to spend time with their kids. And so you really start to realize how money starts to weave its influence into all of these different spheres. And I think there's an interesting story that I mentioned in the book that I always think is pretty fascinating, is when I was about 9 years old, there was a scooter that I really wanted. I wanted this scooter so badly, it was at the toy store. And I saved up for like 3 or 4 months to try and buy the scooter. And I went in there with my dad at the time and my two brothers, and we went up to the till to go pay for the scooter. And all of a sudden, my dad was like, "Ah, man, I feel guilty that you're getting a scooter and your two brothers aren't. So you know what? I'm going to pay for their scooter, but you can pay for yours." And so I had to pay for mine out of my pocket money, which I saved for like 3 months. And when I look back on this experience, I realized that, if anything, this was the Cantillon effect. It's those closest to the monetary spigot benefit disproportionately. And I didn't have as close a relationship with my dad as my two brothers did. But now you see, moving throughout life, my two brothers, they lent a lot on my parents, but you see politically, they're a lot more socialist. They look for handouts, they look for intervention and support intervention. Whereas I think I feel really lucky that my mum had very much pushed for independence and trying to invest and trying to better yourself and ultimately taking accountability. And when I look at, say, my political views, I'm a lot more libertarian, free market. And so you start to see how our monetary environment shapes us, whether that is our political views, whether that is how we interact with our peers, our parents, and whatnot. And so as money starts breaking down, it starts to have all of these little kind of knock-on effects on all of these different aspects of our life, including the parent-child bond, which I think is arguably the most important bond in society. When we start breaking down the parent-child bond, you start to see a lot of knock-on effects. And we can discuss a little further if you want to, but I would argue that money ultimately, since it started losing value, especially since the 70s when we departed from the gold standard, what has happened is that parents have to work more. They have to work incredibly, they have to work far more. Like in Canada, we have seen a doubling of dual earner families since the 1970s, whereas we've seen a halving of single earner families, which basically means that parents cannot get by on a single wage anymore. Both parents are having to go out and work just to get by. That means they're spending less time with their kids. So if kids are not having their emotional needs met, this is what's leading to things like depression. We're seeing anxiety. We're seeing rising rates of ADHD. We're seeing increasing rates of autism. We're seeing incredible rates of suicide and whatnot, drug abuse, and all of this has stemmed and correlates very highly with a departure of the gold standard. So I'm not saying it's the only factor, but I think that it's a big factor that's playing a role in this.
Sure. And it makes me think of two clips I saw actually today. One was on taxes. It was a parent gave a whole bunch of change to one child. Maybe it was like $1 worth of change. And then here, that's what you earned for, foregoing candy and doing your chores. And now I'm going to take back 75 cents for taxes, and I'm going to give 25 cents to your sister who did nothing, and she's going to get 25 cents for not working and for not doing chores and not foregoing candy. and the kid freaks out. And then there's the other one where American Hodl posted it, and it's the experiment where two chimpanzees are divided by a wall, and they both return a rock to the tester, and one gets a cucumber and one gets a grape. And the one getting a cucumber after a while just starts getting furious and just starts throwing the cucumber back at the administrator of the test, and refuses to even eat unless they could get sort of the fair share or the equal payout for doing the same work. And I've been thinking about a lot about the importance of attachment. I don't know, maybe I have attachment issues. I have no idea. I'm trying to figure this out. But what is a growth mindset and what is a protective mindset?
So first off, I would say, and this is going back to our early years. Now, we have an evolutionary kind of, what's the word? Through evolution, we've basically developed attachment characteristics, because naturally, if you think about it, from a young age, we have to attach to our parents. If we do not attach to our parents, we will not survive. And so we try to form these attachment bonds with our parents. If we do not kind of receive those attachment bonds, that could be devastating. Today, we don't have the same kind of effects that we had as hunter-gatherer tribes, where if we didn't get attachment, we would die. We would maybe be handed off to the state. We would maybe find ourselves in a shelter, or we'd be living within a family and maybe our emotional needs are not being met. But ultimately, attachment is absolutely vital. And this is where, if you think about it, it's really important as a parent, I would argue, your number one goal as a parent is to allow your kid to feel unconditionally loved, so that their love is not dependent on their actions or behavior. Because all of a sudden, that means that kid, if you think about it, if a kid doesn't feel unconditionally loved, it leads to a lot of issues later on in life, whether that is anxiety, whether that is depression, whether that is a sense of codependency in relationships because they're not able to identify themselves or separate themselves from their partner. And so it's really important as a parent to be able to break down, even though we may disagree with a behavior, just because a kid does something that we don't necessarily agree with, that doesn't mean they're going to lose our love. Whereas, so this is separating this growth mindset. When a kid feels unconditionally loved, this helps them to individuate. This helps them because they know they've got that familial support. They're able to separate themselves from the herd and focus on, who am I? What is it that my values are? What is it that motivates me and allows me to kind of add value back to society? Whereas the opposite is true. If a kid does not have those attachment needs met, then they're going to be going through life trying to seek those attachment needs. They don't necessarily know how they can step into this world and individuate and offer whatever it is that their authentic needs are, or their authentic self is. And so I think that it's really important when we think about money. What money does is, when money loses value over time, when money starts breaking down, that creates a ton of stress. First off, our environmental costs start rising, our cost of living starts rising, our cost of food starts rising. So parents have to work more. If parents are working more, then they're not spending time with their kids. Their kids are now looking to their peers for attachment. And if you think about peer relationships, especially early on, peer relationships are very superficial. Kids want to look the same as their peers. They want to sound the same. And so what ends up happening is the kid is not individuating. The kid is not finding out who they are. They're not actually learning about their authentic self. And that can lead to things like depression later on, because they don't know what it is that they value. They're trying to fit in as opposed to feeling that unconditional love from the parent. And today, if you think about it, like the number one cause of stress globally is money issues. Money is, in the States, it's something like 73% of people have monetary stress. It's the second leading cause of divorce. So we know money is an incredible stressor on the family household. And so I think if we're able to fix the monetary side of things, if we're able to have a money that actually supports us, this can help parents by giving them more time to spend time with their kids, nurturing those relationships, helping kids to individuate and actually find their own true calling, as opposed to being a sheep and trying to fit in because they're not getting their attachment needs met by their parents. Sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded approach.
Yeah, I think building on that, though, how does the transition towards peer relationships sort of degrade culture, or, sort of not extend culture? It seems like in more hierarchical or generational relationships with parent-child, culture lasts longer.
For sure. No, I think you bring up such a good point, which is the fact that if we look back throughout history, there are so many of these fads that happen throughout society, whether we're talking about, say, a gothic fad or even the hippie fad to a certain extent. A lot of these fads that happen throughout society, a lot of these ones are spread through peers. And the thing with this is, if you're spreading something through peers, there's usually a lack of authenticity behind it because people are trying to simply fit in. So again, going back to that, they're trying to sound the same, they're trying to dress the same, they're trying to have the same mannerisms and whatnot. Whereas you could look at some of these hunter-gatherer tribes, you look at some of these indigenous populations, and they've passed down culture through thousands of years. I think some of the oldest cultural traits date back something like 78,000 years in some tribes, which is fascinating. It's just like, how do these individuals pass down culture that long? And the reason why is so many of these children, they're not raised by their peers. Instead, they're raised by their parents and their elders. And so when you're being raised by your parents and your elders, they're passing down their generational knowledge. They're passing down their own experiences throughout life. And so if you think about the average parent or even the average grandparent, they've experienced so much more in their life to be able to help guide that kid and kind of act as that solid foundation or compass. Whereas a child, if you're trying to look to your peers for advice, your peers are at the same level. You don't have that same experience. And so this is where, when you've got these tight knit communities, when you've got these tight mesh communities where you're spending a lot of time with your parents and a lot of time with your elders, it hugely helps with the passing down of culture and the passing down of knowledge. And one thing that's really fascinating is, as we've seen the financialization of everything, and this isn't actually just about money here, but I just think it's an interesting point. This is also, as we've seen kind of industrialization, you've also seen the movement of people from rural areas to cities. So if you look at, say, the US, I believe it was 100 years ago, something like 80% of the population worked in rural areas, whether it's through farming towns, machine work, you name it. Whereas today, there's something like less than 2% of the population work in the farming industry. And instead, 80% of the population lives in cities. So we've seen people go from these small communities where you're dealing with family, you're dealing with parents, you're dealing with elders, you're dealing with neighbors, to these communities whereby all of a sudden you don't know anyone. You can walk around the streets of New York and you can see 100,000 people in a day, and you don't know a single one of these people. And so it's a very lonely experience where people are not necessarily getting their attachment needs met, which is also impacting culture. It's all impacting authenticity. And I would argue that money has a huge part to play in this, because as our money breaks down, our parents don't have the time and the resources to be able to support us in the way that we need.
Right. And then along those lines, because you bring up interesting points, what have you seen with screens and their impact on sort of work, family, and the parent-child bond?
So again, like you're saying, as money kind of funnels into technology, as technology advances, there are incredible benefits to technology advancing. But at the same time, there's also a massive amount of detriment to technology advancing when it comes, especially in screens. So we're seeing a lot of kids, if you just think about it, social media arguably was kind of created to bring people together. But I would actually say that it's very much done the opposite, because what it's done is people don't tend to show the challenges they're facing in life. People don't tend to show the hardship. Instead, people create this facade of this person who they want to show to the world. So to the uninitiated, to the kid who hasn't necessarily deeply thought about what it is that they're viewing, they see everyone else is succeeding, everyone else is having success and knows what they're doing in life, but I'm not. Now, the reality is that's not true at all. Everyone's just trying to figure it out. No one has it figured out. And so a lot of these kids, it's leading to depression. It's leading to this society where I would say kids don't know who they are because they're simply trying to follow along with these fads. Because again, they're not having their needs met by their peers. And one of the things that's also interesting that we're seeing is, if you think about consumerism, like money, as it loses value, it doesn't incentivize us to save. If our purchasing power is going to be its highest in the present moment right now, then we're actually incentivized to consume because our money goes furthest in this present moment. Whereas flip that on its head. If you had something with a fixed supply, let's just say Bitcoin, if you have something with a fixed supply, as productivity increases, as technology advances and costs come down, your purchasing power actually increases over time. So the inverse is true. All of a sudden, we're actually incentivized to save over consume because tomorrow our money is worth more. So you can start to see how money changes our incentives. Fiat money incentivizes us to consume over save because our money is worth less over time. Bitcoin does the reverse. It incentivizes us to save over consume because our money is worth more over time. So I find it so fascinating how, again, as you mentioned at the start, the book talks, The Hidden Cost of Money kind of talks a lot more about the psychology of money and how money impacts us on a psychological level. It impacts our behavior. And I think it's so fascinating when you start diving into all of these different rabbit holes, because you really start to realize that money on a foundational level is really impacting every single aspect of a society. It's not just this thing we use to transact day in, day out. It really does. It's the energy at which we expend. We have to, obviously, in order to obtain money, we have to expend time and energy. It's because we have only a finite time in our lives. You can think of money as basically just a store of our time, and we are very conscious of how we spend that. So if someone is stealing our time through inflation, if someone is stealing our time through debasement, then of course that's going to impact how we redirect our time.
Of course. And what I like how the book then turns to looking at the economy again and thinking about sort of the nature of intervention. Because I think about it in terms of parents who intervene and maybe give their kids a protective mindset. And you expand on the four stages of economic ruin that come from, sort of central planning. And maybe we could talk about misalignment to reality and
Sure.
what you're seeing there. Yeah.
Well, so first off, I'll give an example which I find is just like super fascinating, which is if we think about money, money is meant to play kind of like three main roles. It's meant to be a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. And if you guys, I assume you guys are Bitcoiners, are listening to this, you've probably heard of these three things before. Now let's just focus on one of those, which is a store of value. Now, when it comes to fiat money, we no longer have a store of value in fiat, but that doesn't mean people are going to stop searching for a store of value. People that have money want to store that value because they want to pass it down to their kids. They want to have that generational wealth. So what do? They go and invest it in things like real estate. They go and invest it in things like equities. They go invest it in not so much gold, but you see people investing in gold, especially since it's been going up recently. But what that does is because money is losing value over time and it no longer acts as a store of value, people look to real estate and these other assets for value. So you start to see their price start to rise. And now where I live here in Whistler, I'm renting kind of a basement suite, but the average house price is $4.5 million. And you start to realize that 61% of these houses are empty. And it's not because people don't want to make money. It's because people have basically bought these, or sorry, people are not using them to live in. People have bought these things purely just to store value. And we're seeing the same thing in farming. When money starts losing value, people need to store that value somewhere. So they start buying up farmland, but they don't want to farm. These individuals don't want to farm. Instead, they start stopping using the asset for its utility, which is whether it's a house and it's living in, or whether it's farming and it's growing crops. And they start basically using these things basically simply as a store of value. So you're taking this productive asset off society, off the people that are actually using that asset to create value or using that asset to put a roof over their kids. And now you're just using it simply as a store of wealth. And so this is, again, going back to the four stages of economic ruin. When you start to break down money, when money starts losing value, you start to see all of these symptoms in society. And I would say that rising house prices, rising equity prices, these are not, in the rates at which we've seen them grow, these are not natural. The reason why we've seen them rise to the extent to which they have is because our money has lost its ability to store value. So why does this happen? So this goes back to your initial question, which is the four stages of economic ruin. In the book, I step back and I spent a lot of time thinking about what is it about intervention, especially monetary intervention, that creates a breakdown in society. And I kind of like put it down to four stages. So the first stage is this kind of misalignment to reality. And this goes back to kind of Jeff Booth's book, The Price of Tomorrow. If you think about all technology is always trying to get more for less. And the example I always like to use is Blockbuster versus Netflix. Blockbuster, you used to have to drive down to the store, expending gas and time to go and rent a movie. You'd then spend half an hour in the store. You'd then spend $8, $9 or whatever renting the movie. You then drive back home, watch the movie, drive back down to the store, drop off the movie, drive back home. You think about how much time, energy, and money you had to invest just to be able to watch one movie. And now you look at Netflix. Netflix, you can invest that same money that you would have spent on one movie, but now you've got millions of movies basically at your fingertips. Like they're always trying to get more for less. And it's the same with the horse and the cart versus the car. It's the same with basically any form of technology. If you think about it, it's always trying to improve on the previous whatever came before it. And so what Jeff Booth argues is that technology is always basically going to drive down prices because we're trying to get more for less. And if you think about it, today, do we see prices falling? No, prices are rising. So why are we not seeing prices falling? And this is this monetary intervention. When we have a debt-based society, if prices were falling and we had a certain amount of debt, then that actually means that our debt becomes more and more burdensome over time. If you as a corporation have a bunch of debt, but over time your prices are falling, that means you're actually generating less revenue unless you continue to outpace this decline in kind of technology. So we kind of come to this kind of issue where we have a misalignment to reality. Like the S&P 500 is 70% less labor intensive than it was in the 80s. And that's all because technology is trying to actually improve society and allowing us to do more with less. But we have this huge amount of debt. So if our prices are meant to be falling and we have a huge amount of debt, what do? We have to continually intervene. But the problem is, if we continually intervene, we start to see these issues throughout society. And this kind of leads us to the next stage. So the misalignment to reality, and then the death of creative destruction. So if prices are falling and you're an indebted company, you're an indebted individual, you're an indebted nation, then that would mean naturally at some point you're not going to be able to service your debt levels and you're probably going to collapse. So what happens? The government steps in and starts bailing you out. Now, this is where you're starting to break down creative destruction. If you are a company that is heavily indebted and you're not able to service your debt, then all of a sudden you should wither away because there's someone who's going to be able to offer more value that's able to rise up. But if the government comes in and steps in and bails you out, then what has that told that competitor? Well, it's directed capital and saved your ass. And now that competitor has to use money that it would have used towards innovation and growth. And now it has to use money to actually compete against this person that shouldn't even exist. So you start suppressing innovation. You start to basically destroy competition because you're creating this you're basically neglecting this natural free market principle, which is creative destruction, where if someone is offering more value than another, then that's the one who is not offering value will slowly wither away. And then so that leads us to the third stage. If you're not allowing creative destruction to take place, then money is not going to flow to where value is created because there's a bunch of companies that are existing that shouldn't exist, and now they're absorbing capital, whether that's through intervention or whether that's through our own consumer spending. And so this basically starts to amplify long-term fragility, which leads to our the fourth stage, which is decision-making impairment. If we don't know what the free, unimpeded market deems valuable, because there's a bunch of companies that should or should not exist, and we don't actually know what the actual risks in the economy are, because we're basically investing in companies that should not exist, the government is not actually seeing true supply and demand, how can we allocate capital efficiently? How can we actually make accurate decision-making based on this information that we have no idea what should exist and what shouldn't exist? So this is where I would argue that this misalignment to reality, the death of creative destruction, capital flow distortion leads to decision-making impairment. And those four stages are ultimately why intervention breaks down society, because we lose the ability to see what is actually in front of us. And you can think about it in a relationship. If you're not communicating with your partner and the relationship starts to break down and you don't know what your partner's needs are, how are you going to fix the relationship? You cannot fix the relationship. You need to know what the needs are in society. You need to know what people deem valuable for you to be able to actually support society. And so that's the same thing is true with individuals. If we want to create value in society, we want to know where capital is flowing. If capital is flowing to businesses that shouldn't exist, that's not value creation, that's value destruction. Capital is going into this black hole that is basically a corporation that should not exist. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded response.
No, that was awesome. And, part in the book that kind of, I think, might even get, a whole book of its own is the monetization of everything. And I want to read from it a bit here. So in our ever burgeoning world, the relentless pursuit of economic growth and the need to service mounting debt has led to the monetization of virtually everything around us, from tangible assets to intangible experiences. We must drive monetary growth in areas where monetary exchange previously did not exist. For example, entertainment and media, community events, local performances, and shared cultural activities used to provide free entertainment. However, the expansion of the entertainment industry, the development of media platforms, and the introduction of subscription-based models have led to the monetization of entertainment through ticket sales, subscriptions, and access fees. And communication. In earlier times, people relied on public spaces and community gatherings for communication. However, the advent of telecommunication networks, mobile phones, and internet services led to the monetization of communication through phone bills, internet subscriptions, and various communication devices. Even water. Historically, water was often obtained freely from local sources such as wells or rivers. However, with the rise of bottled water companies and the privatization of water resources, access to clean drinking water has been commercialized. It's interesting with the entertainment and communication. Like I think of like people going to a concert and texting for a fee to put like "Happy Birthday," Tommy on the screen or something, and all that is about status and connection. But to your point with urbanization, you're not really connecting with your group. You're just connecting with randoms, and you're sort of buying that right to speak. It's very interesting. And then where does that kind of put our mindset? So I'd love to turn to sort of the link between money and behavior and how money shapes how we act. What have you seen with money's effect on behavior, and maybe starting with time preference?
Well, so, first off, I just wanted to kind of touch on that point you made, which I think is so fascinating. And that is the fact that, like, if we actually just think about what GDP is, like gross domestic product, it's basically just the culmination of transactions that happen in a society in any given year. And what's interesting, the central bank is always trying to target GDP growth. So what is it they're actually trying to target? They're actually just trying to target more monetary transactions. And so when you think about money, and when you think about this economy that is constantly trying to grow because it's got a massive burden of debt, and we're just trying to constantly debase the currency in order to increase growth, increase our transactions and whatnot, what ends up happening is you're basically incentivizing more and more and more transactions and turning products that were previously non-monetized into monetized products. And so if you think about, say, Looking Glass is this platform that Greg Foss, Dasby, and a couple others and myself founded. We create a lot of free content. Free content does not contribute to GDP. Therefore, it does not impact GDP. The only way for us to be able to impact GDP is for us to monetize that content. But have we really added value to society by taking something that was previously free and now making it paid? You've put a barrier that's actually impeding people's ability to be able to access it. And so when we're targeting as a society GDP growth, and we're saying the economy is stronger than ever, we're like, this is a metric for showing how phenomenal our economy is. The reality is, what it's really saying is that a lot of these value services that we once had in society that have been monetized, just because we can now measure them, that doesn't make society better. It actually makes our cost of living rise, because in order to do the things that we once did for free, we now have to pay for. And so a perfect example would be like in Canada, you used to be able to go wherever you want in terms of like travel across the land, through the mountains. Now, if you want to go to a national park, you have to pay for national park passes just to be able to go in certain areas of the country. And so you start to realize that that wouldn't have made a difference. Like, in order to be able to access that land previously, it would not have impacted GDP. So that's no good for the government. That's no good for central bankers who want to see GDP growth. So we've got to start monetizing things. We've got to start trying to add value to society, but it's not really adding value, because it's actually taking something away that we once had without having to kind of spend money. And I just wanted to make that point because I think it is super fascinating.
Sure.
So going back to behavior, this is where I'd mentioned it previously, but this money is so fascinating because it starts to alter how we show up in this world. And when it comes to Bitcoin, well, Bitcoiners, we talk a lot about time preference. So I'll go over that one first. But time preference, if you think about it, it's basically, do we look to the future to try and build a more prosperous environment for ourselves, our family, and those we care about? Or do we focus on just servicing immediate needs? And so you'd say, if you've got a high time preference, you're trying to service those immediate needs. If you've got a low time preference, you're looking to the future and you're trying to build that security. And I gave that quick example previously, but if you think about money, when money is losing value over time, and just take the US dollar, since I think we departed from, or sorry, since the foundation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, has lost like 96% of its purchasing power. And so what $3 and something is like $3.50 purchased in 1913 is what $100 today purchases. So it's just, we need to consume so many more dollars to be able to obtain the same things that we did for far less back 100 years ago. And so you start to realize that when money is losing value over time, we're not incentivized to save. Instead, we're incentivized to consume. And so we have this society that is constantly incentivized to go out and try and get what it can, a very extractionist society, because life is getting harder. So I need to get what I can while I still can. Whereas the flip side is true in a world that's maybe built upon Bitcoin. If you have a currency that is fixed in supply, and as we talked about, as technology advances and prices start to fall, all of a sudden, you actually have increasing purchasing power. So we're actually incentivized to save over time rather than consume. So it's actually flipped our time preference. We're actually incentivized to think long term as opposed to incentivized to do what we can in this moment and get what we can from society. So that's kind of the first, I would say, the largest change to our behavior. Just by changing whether or not money increases in value or decreases, we've actually incentivized whether we think long term or whether we think in the short term. And then the next one I talk about is kind of compassion and altruism. Like, if you ever think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and a lot of people have probably heard about this, you've got kind of this 4 or 5 tier pyramid. And on the base, it talks about your shelter and food and whatnot. If you don't have your shelter and food needs met, you can't work on those layers above, which are like relationships, self-actualization and whatnot. And so it's really important to get those needs met. But when we have a population whereby I think in the US, 1/3 is below the poverty line and 2/3 are living paycheck to paycheck, you start to realize that we don't have the capacity to be compassionate and to be altruistic and give back to society and give back to our community because we're threatened. We're threatened because we don't know how we're going to afford our next food bill or how we're going to afford rent because I'm not earning enough from the job that I'm working. And so this is where you start to see compassion and altruism suffering. And that's not to say that there are many countries in the world that are developing that see incredible amounts of compassion and altruism. There are amazing individuals that are on the bottom rung of society that are incredibly compassionate and altruistic. But in general, we have less capacity to be compassionate and altruistic when we are being pressured and when we're being threatened by our monetary system. And then that leads us to the kind of the third kind of behavior. And there's a lot more, but these are kind of 3 that I think are really important. And this is kind of this meaninglessness and apathy. And that is when we no longer reap what we sow, we can very much fall into this apathy and this meaningless. And so for instance, if we're working our ass off in our job and we've been paid this paycheck, and then a large portion of it goes to taxes, and then there's all this stealth taxation through the debasement of currency, and then this intervention from the government bailing out Ukraine and money being sent here and money being sent there, all of a sudden, this energy that we've committed to our job and we've been rewarded with is being used and diverted to all of these other areas of society without our control. And so what this means is we're no longer reaping what we sow. If we're trying to get ahead in society, and so give the example that I gave earlier here in Whistler, when the average house is $4.5 million, yet the average income is $30,000, that very much leads to meaninglessness. I used to have a friend, I used to work for an outdoor retailer, and a good friend of mine, one day I was asking him, I was just like, how are you doing? And because he seemed super depressed, and he was like, you know what? I've given up on trying to afford a house. I'm never going to get ahead. So he just started blowing his money. And it made me feel super sad because you start to see how this people become, I can't think of the word, but basically people just, they start kind of breaking down. Their soul starts breaking down when you can no longer get ahead, when you're no longer able to benefit from trying to contribute to society, where you basically just feel like a cog in this larger machine and you're simply just being used for your productive capacity and you're not actually able to enjoy life. And so I would say, like, going back to those 3, you've got kind of time preference, where money, when it breaks down, incentivizes you to think short term. You've then got a breakdown of compassion and altruism. When we're threatened because our money is worth less, when we're no longer able to support our family, support ourselves, all of a sudden we stop being able to give back to society. And then finally, meaninglessness and apathy. If we're not reaping what we sow, how can we expect to feel productive and how can we expect to want to kind of give back to society if we don't actually reap what we sow?
Yeah, I really agree there. And one of the areas that I really see this breakdown in compassion and altruism is around taxes and charity. So I see this notion of, we have to pay a lot in taxes. If we pay less in taxes, people are not going to give money in charity anyway. They wouldn't do it if there were no taxes there. They wouldn't do it of their own accord. And I think that's sort of that, that apathy. And
actually, to that point, like, this is where I think it's so fascinating. Like, I talk about it later in the book, and actually the final chapter, and that is taxation. And taxation is really interesting. Like if you actually read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx talks a lot about how one of the 10 kind of traits of a communist society is a very progressive tax system. But if you think about what progressive tax actually means, it means that you're actually taxing and taking from those that are actually adding the most value to society. Now, you could argue, are the wealthy really adding the most value to society? But if we just kind of step back for a second and assume that a large amount of those wealthy individuals have created companies and they have added value to society, what you're saying is you're taxing the people that have the greatest capacity to add value to society, and you're redirecting it to those that have the least capacity to add value to society. Now, on the short term, yes, I think it's important to support the bottom rung, 100%. But if we start thinking bigger picture, we're actually impeding society and the kind of maximizing the human civilization if we're rediverting capital away from. Oh, 1 second. Oh, there you are. I was just saying, if we're rediverting capital away from those that are able to add value to society and moving it towards those that aren't, all of a sudden, we're rediverting capital, we're supporting with those that maybe are unable to use that capital to the same extent that the others would be. And what that also means is it's actually taking away that incentive for those individuals to actually step into society and try and add value. Because if they know they're going to be supported, then why add value to society? So you start to play around with these incentives and it starts breaking things down.
Yeah. And all of it, I think, just leads to dehumanization and sort of, I guess, the effects of that. And so what did you learn or think about with locus of control? And people have like a strong internal locus of control.
So when it comes to I find this fascinating. It will give it a little more context. I've always found psychology super interesting, and basically how the world impacts us and how our internal environment, our mind impacts how we show up in the world. And the internal and external locus of control is basically, do we think if we've got an internal locus of control, it is that we believe that we can control the world around us, we can make change, and we basically govern the trajectory of our life. Whereas an external locus of control is the inverse. It is that we believe that we have no control and the world basically plays its hand on us and we just have to kind of live by this. And what I notice is money is changing our locus of control. If we enter this world and all of a sudden we realize that actually if we work hard, we can get that house. And if we get that house and we can support our family, our locus of control shifts internally. And people naturally, there are countless studies. This isn't theory. There are countless psychological studies done on locus of control, looking at how if you have a more internal locus of control, you have better health outcomes, you have lower rates of depression, you have greater confidence in life, because ultimately you believe you have the capacity to create change. People with an external locus of control where money is losing value, like my friend that I'd mentioned, who no longer feels as if he can purchase a house, he can no longer get by in our current monetary system. The inverse is true. He doesn't have confidence. He has depression arising because he doesn't feel like he has control. And so this is where, again, money is actually shifting our health outcomes. And if you think about it, going back to kind of the parenting example, where we're talking about how it's impacting children, it's also impacting us as individuals, whereby stress, but money being the number one stressor in society, stress acutely impacts our immune system, because our immune system and our nervous system are intimately linked. So when we feel stress, it impacts our nervous system. When we feel our nervous system broken down, it impacts our immune system. When our immune system is broken down, it impacts our emotional state. And so as an individual, when money starts breaking down, when we're feeling this immense stress, we start to get sicker, we start to have worse health outcomes. And so this is where you can see it in society. We have rising rates of obesity. We have rising rates of health issues. We have rising rates of allergies. And although I'm not saying that money is the only factor, there are countless factors in this. I think money is a large factor.
Yeah, I mean, it just starts even at birth. And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'm a parent. And when your spouse or yourself gives birth, if it's in a hospital, I mean, one of the first things they're kind of offering you is the formula. And I mean, some people might need to use formula for whatever reasons, but I think it's sort of over encouraged. And right there, there's sort of maybe an invasiveness to the parent-child bond or monetization of the parent-child bond, which then drives incentives in a different way and advice and guidance.
Oh man, I couldn't agree more. And what I think is super fascinating as well is in my studies of kind of diving into psychology, you also start looking at the nervous system, you start looking at trauma. And what you start to realize is given that money is such a huge stress in society, when you think about when that baby is inside kind of its mum's womb, when that baby is kind of in its prime developing like months or time, stress, when the mother is feeling stress, it acutely impacts the baby. And so if monetary stress is our number one stressor, and that baby is feeling that stress from the mum through cortisol flushing through that baby's bloodstream, what ends up happening is you just need to step back and you start to realize that we are seeing massive increase in health outcomes. And the reason we're seeing a rising rate of like health issues, and the reason why we're seeing that is because we have naturally evolutionarily developed certain characteristics that allow us to maximize our chances of survival. And those are fight, flight, freeze, and there's a couple more, but those ones usually aren't talked about. But fight, flight, and freeze, these are evolutionary outcomes to maximize our chance of survival. So in the event that we find ourselves threatened, we may freeze or try to minimize being seen, or we may flight, we may run away. But what this does to our nervous system, if you think about, let's take freeze, for instance. When we are in a state of freeze, it actually slows our blood flow. That slowing of the blood flow slows nutrient absorption. So it starts actually reducing the ability for the body to obtain nutrients. It also slows our breathing rates. We're not getting oxygen to the brain. When a mum is incredibly stressed and cortisol starts flushing through the child, what ends up happening is the child's threat response system, like freeze and flight, starts to get activated. And that kid can be born with a hyperactive threat response system. And that can hugely impact that kid's health outcomes throughout his life. Because if you've got a hyperactive threat response system, that kid has got slowed blood flow. That kid has got reduced nutrient absorption. That kid has got basically impaired breathing, whatnot. So you start to see how stress impacts that child's health outcomes moving forward. And that's from money. And so this is where it starts to impact our health. I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of the reasons I came to Bitcoin is just trying to figure out a way to get more time with my family, and watch my kids grow up. And I think about the parent-child bond. You wrote as the world-renowned physician Gabor, I don't know if it's Mate or Mate puts it, attachment enables children to hitch a ride with adults who are, at least in the mind of a child, assumed to be more capable of orienting themselves and finding their way. I think that's really interesting because, kids are with adults, maybe I don't mean teachers, but parents and even grandparents less and less. I think that's probably the most important relationship, I think, in this modern era for a child is with the grandparent. But I think we're in this era where grandparents are spending less and less time by choice with their grandchildren. They don't want to schlep an hour to watch the kids for a few hours. They want to watch their show. They want to go play tennis. They want to go to Rome. You don't hear about I mean, at least from my peers and what I'm reading, just grandparents are less involved, I think, almost voluntarily and more self-involved, at least in this generation. And maybe that's since 1971 and how well they've done with negative trending interest rates for the last 50 years. You went on to write, furthermore, when a child develops a solid parental attachment, this acts as a foundation for them to confront the world from a state of growth. As parents promote, one, unconditional love. Parents often strive to establish an unconditional love bond, making it clear that although they may disagree with certain behaviors, their love towards the child is not dependent on the child's behavior. This assists the children in growing up knowing that love is not temporary and based on their actions. The child can then express themselves fully, taking greater risks without fear of judgment. This comfort with pushing boundaries and trying new things assists in maturation and psychological growth. Two, exploring one's authentic self. Parents often enable a safe environment for children to feel comfortable expressing themselves both emotionally and physically. When a child is rejected by their peers as a result of their behavior, it often leads to, I am not worthy, I am not good enough, I need to hide who I am because it is unacceptable. This doesn't support healthy emotional processing as it pressures conformity. Instead, parents often explore why their child is behaving the way they are and try to meet their child's needs. This reduces the risk that the child feels lost, helpless, and lonely, pervasive in today's teens and young adults. In search of connection, they have put others before themselves. In doing so, they have lost sight of who they are, their values and what they need at any given moment. And I do see that a lot. And you go on to write, just like a child needs a sense of self, how can humanity flourish if we don't have a clear sense of who we are or what we want? Although there are many factors at play, there's been since the transition away from gold standard, we have seen a tremendous rise in depression, as well as ADHD and obesity. And even more alarming, 1 in 3 youth aged 13 to 18 will face an anxiety disorder. And every year, 1 in 5 Americans receives a mental disease diagnosis. Suicide kills more than 48,300 individuals in the US and 800,000 people worldwide, making it the second most common cause of death in the US for teenagers aged 15 to 24. Drug overdoses claim 81,000 lives per year in the US. Given that money consistently ranks as the #1 stressor in life, affecting 73% of Americans, and is the second leading cause of divorce, could it be contributing to the health challenges we face through its impact on prenatal mothers and parental attachment? I mean, these figures are astonishing. I mean, the link between parenting money is, tremendous, and I think really weighing on people and maybe the family unit. Zooming out a bit, though, because there we kind of explored sort of the misalignment of reality and this thinking that kind of happens through this sort of stress. So kind of zooming out a bit, turning more to macro, what is a VC unicorn? And maybe we can get into sort of unproductive capital there.
For sure. So I wanted to make one more point because you bring up such good sections of the book that it's just, you always want to elaborate on them. And I think it's really important to mention, like, very early on in the book, in the introduction, I explain how I view money. And I think everyone's got these kind of different takes on money. You look at Saylor, and Saylor talks about how money is a battery that stores time. And so if you've got a poor battery, naturally, if you keep it in the cupboard for a little while, that battery, you go to use it, and it's freaking half empty, half depleted. And so when I look at money, I look at it as simply like language, it's a medium of expression. But also, like language, it can be censored. And so with language, when we start to get censored, we can't express to the world what it is that we value. And money is exactly the same. Monetarily, when we start to be censored, all of a sudden we can't direct money where we see fit. And whether that censorship is because we're seeing our money lose its purchasing power over time, and so we're not able to direct that purchasing power that was once ours to where we see fit. Instead, the government can redirect that purchasing power, or whether we see capital controls that impede us from spending money where we want to spend it. Like you look at China, you've got these millionaires, billionaires, that they don't want to store their money in the yuan. They want to move that money elsewhere, but you've got these capital controls impeding their ability to move their money overseas. And that's because ultimately the government benefits by keeping that money within its nation, because it can devalue that currency and use it towards its own means, as opposed to allowing that capital flight. And so I look at money as this kind of medium expression. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. And you can see it very simply if you just go into a grocery store, and if you see one individual buying grass-fed meat and high quality, like organic, locally sourced vegetables, and then you see another person buying cigarettes and TV dinner, you can see what it is that they value. Every time we spend money, you can see someone's values. And so when money basically starts breaking down, when money starts deteriorating, it actually changes how we express to the world what it is that we value, because we cannot direct money where we want to direct it. Instead, we're forced to direct it somewhere else. And so I think it's really, really important just to mention that, because this is kind of how I look at money and ultimately how it kind of weaves its influence in throughout society. Because when you start breaking down money, you start basically seeing all these symptoms starting to arise: a breakdown in the parent-child bond, a breakdown in businesses, a breakdown in the environment and whatnot, because this is all of these symptoms from money. And it's the same thing if we go back to when I've mentioned it's like language. As a child, if our parents didn't support us emotionally, if they didn't allow us to feel certain emotions like anger or sadness because they themselves felt uncomfortable with that, then as an adult, we would grow up being unable to express ourselves in those emotions, whether it's sadness and anger and whatnot. And so that can lead to things like depression. And so censorship, again, when our language is censored, when our ability to express ourselves emotionally is censored, all of a sudden you start to get these byproducts. When our ability to express ourselves monetarily is censored, you start to get all these byproducts, because we're impeding where we naturally want to express ourselves. So anyway, going back to kind of business, what I think is so fascinating is that when governments, well, so first off, to answer your question, a unicorn is basically $1 billion company that has yet to make any money, and it is basically not publicly traded. And so you've probably heard of like Theranos, and you've probably heard of WeWork. These are all kind of these unicorn companies. And what's interesting is as we have seen greater and greater monetary intervention, so as we've seen the suppression of interest rates, we've seen the exponential growth in unicorn companies. And the reason why that happens is because if you think about what interest rates are a measure of risk in the economy. If interest rates are rising, it's showing that people aren't willing to lend their money for the same amount that they used to. They need to demand a higher rate because they think there's risk in the economy, and vice versa. If interest rates are declining, then that tends to mean that people feel relatively confident in the economy, and therefore they're willing to accept a lower return of interest. Now, when the government starts suppressing interest rates artificially, what ends up happening is you don't see the risk in the economy because interest rates aren't allowed to rise. What also happens is all of these companies that have basically borrowed massively beyond their means, whether it is WeWork, whether it is Theranos, all of a sudden it's extended their runway, because if an interest rate started to rise and they couldn't service their debt levels, they would naturally break down. But instead, the opposite happens. As interest rates are suppressed, these companies that should have drifted away and broken down instead continue to operate. And so if you look at a lot of these unicorn companies, we are seeing trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of capital flooding into these companies, and they've yet to ever turn a profit. And 90% of them fail. And a lot of that money is moving away from companies that are actually creating value in society. And so this is where, like, a perfect example I tend to look at is Tesla. Although it isn't really a true unicorn because it is actually publicly traded, Tesla at its peak had a market capitalization that was $500 billion larger than that of Toyota, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, GM, Ford, Stellantis, which is Fiat, Chrysler, and Peugeot, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, Nissan, and Renault combined. That is fascinating. Yet it sold a fraction of those cars. And then you start looking at its price to earnings ratio, and at its peak, it was 1,386, which means if you'd invested in Tesla at that price, you would have, in order to basically make back your return, you would basically have had to have waited 1,386 years. Like, this is where, when you start intervening monetarily, when you start suppressing interest rates, you create all of these byproducts. And one of those byproducts is capital floods into these companies that otherwise would not exist. And like, we've seen so many of them, WeWork, Theranos, suck up billions of dollars that could have otherwise gone to areas of the economy that are offering value. Instead, they go into these investments that are basically just being propped up by intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I love the question you asked earlier in the book: is a system supported by intervention sustainable? And we're going to get into a lot of these examples now. I mean, this sort of like misallocation or misalignment of reality, it's just stark. When that's kind of unproductive capital we were talking about, but it permeates everywhere. And you go on to talk about in terms of regulation. You take American education. Student and teacher numbers have only increased by 7.6 and 8%, respectively. The number of district administrators has surged by a staggering 87%. And you go on to question, as administrators take center stage, you can't help but wonder about the potential long-term impacts on learning. You see this in the medical industry with billing agents, and there's like 3 billers per doctor now. Doctor sees you for 8 minutes, and then there's 77 minutes of billing, all to lie to the insurance company about what you were there for, to get the most money out of you and monetize your time there. And you see it with even Chicago public schools, where a lot of the schools have very little enrollment. Reading and math grades are going down, graduation rates are going up, but they're still spending tremendous amount of money on the infrastructure for these schools, even though kids aren't attending. It's just a misallocation of capital and wealth. And you wonder, can our economy survive all this intervention? But then you look at it in terms of politics and democracy, and sort of this short-term thinking there. And what do you see with politics in terms of the distortion and destruction from subsidies and bailouts, and this goal to alleviate all immediate pain?
So it's such a tough one. And the reason why, again, politics, naturally, when you start intervening, you're going to see all these byproducts. And then the government steps in and they try to regulate. They try to increase regulation because they want to stop this misallocation of capital. They want to stop this fiscal responsibility, not realizing that it is their intervention that is creating this misallocation of capital. It is their intervention that is creating this fiscal irresponsibility. And so this is why we're seeing, exactly to your point where you're talking about the teachers and the administrators. We've seen a 7% growth in teachers and an 87% growth in administrators. It's why we're seeing every time an individual just pops into a hospital, there's $1,200 spent on compliance before that patient has even seen the doctor. And then we've also seen, like in the UK, there used to be one financial regulator to every 11,000 city workers. In 2008, that was one per 300. So as you start to get all this misallocation of capital, all this fiscal irresponsibility going on, we start to see increased regulation. But then increased regulation just leads to more capital destruction, because if people are having to pay for, if companies are having to pay for regulators, that is money that could be going towards research and development. That is money that could be going towards trying to grow the company and offer more value in society. But instead, this capital is just being sucked up under all of this regulatory compliance. And so it's really, really challenging. And then going back to that politics again, and this is, I would say, that's the biggest bug with our current system, is that the government ultimately controls the money printer. And I would say if there's one thing that we need to change, if we want to realign the incentives in society towards kind of prosperity and value creation, you have to remove money and government. And the reason why I say that is because if you think about a business, if a business has a money printer in its back office, it does not have to offer value to society. It can simply go about and do whatever it wants to do without ever having to offer value. And this is the same with politicians. Politicians can simply seek whatever it is that benefits them. They can pursue their own agenda to a certain extent without actually having to worry about balancing their books, without actually having to worry about adding value. And so I believe that when government and politics have control over the money printer, they start to see this short-term pain alleviation where they're just like, you know what? The economy is not doing so great right now. Rather than looking at why is the economy not doing so great, they come and they try and prop it up. They start to intervene. They start to step in and start to subsidize. And that only exacerbates the issues. Now, what's so fascinating is I actually just listened to today, Lynn Alden, what's her name? It was one of the What Bitcoin Did podcasts with the lady behind Custodia Bank. Phenomenal lady.
Caitlin Long?
Yeah, Caitlin Long. And she mentioned something that I'd never heard about. And that is that before the Great Depression in 1920, there was another depression that was just as deep and had just as high unemployment. I did not realize this. And she mentions that the reason why we don't talk about this depression is because it only lasted 9 months. And it happened because after World War I, basically the US, the UK had spent a ton. And they went back onto the gold standard at the same rate pre-World War I. So all of a sudden you had this huge deflationary collapse. But the central bank didn't step in. And because the central bank didn't step in, the depression only lasted 9 months and then the economy was back to where it was. So all of a sudden, you start to realize if we actually have a free market, if we allow creative destruction to take place, the economy can move through pain a lot quicker. When we start stepping in and intervening, you start to create all these issues. And a perfect example, which I give in the book, is in Canada, when the pandemic hit, we had the government step in with something called the CERB. It's a Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And they were basically giving anyone who basically lost their job or anyone who was struggling financially $2,000 a month. Now, what is interesting is if you look at tax returns, I think it's 25 or 30% of the population earn below $25,000 a year. So if you're getting given $2,000 a month, which is $24,000 a year, what has the government just done? It's actually incentivized you to quit your job because you actually gain more money leaning on the government subsidy than you do going and working and adding productive value to society. And so here, again, the government intervenes because it's trying to support people. But what it's actually done is just decimated small business, put a ton of businesses out of business because they can't find employees, all in the goal of trying to support the economy. And they've done the exact opposite. And this is just one example. But you also see, like in 2008, the amount of intervention that we saw was more than every single war leading up to the 2008 combined. Like that is immense. And you saw, even with all of that intervention, you still saw something like a third of the US lose their house or lose their their rental accommodation and whatnot. You've people just being destroyed economically. This intervention is not supporting people. Instead, it's stopping fiscal irresponsibility from actually being kind of wiped clean in the economy. It's incentivizing it.
Right. I mean, it's just astounding. And you go on to, I got to read this from the book, The Distortion and Destruction from Subsidies and Bailouts. During the era of British rule in India, the capital city of Delhi grappled with a problem. Is it Delhi?
Billy.
Delhi. A significant population of venomous cobras. To address the problem, the British government devised a plan that involved providing financial incentives in the form of a bounty for every dead cobra. However, this well-intentioned subsidy backfired, and the cobra population multiplied instead of decreasing. The subsidy inadvertently created a lucrative opportunity for individuals to capture and breed cobras solely to claim the bounty. Consequently, resources and efforts that would have likely been channeled into more productive endeavors were diverted toward cobra breeding. So what is it about subsidies that often leads to unproductive behavior? I got to read this too from the Great Financial Crisis Bailouts. As Dr. Nomi Prinz recounts in her book, It Takes a Pillage, by the third quarter of 2009, the government bailout had totaled an astonishing 13.3 trillion. 7.6 trillion from the Fed, 2.5 trillion from the Treasury, including the 700 billion troubled asset relief program, 1.5 trillion from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and 1.4 trillion joint effort and a $300 billion housing bill. And the effort and a $300 billion housing bill. Dr. Prinz draws the shocking comparison that this total amount is more money than the combined cost of every major U.S. war, including the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, whose total price tag adjusted for inflation is 7.2 trillion. And that was only the start. Dr. Prinz also remarks that 50 trillion in global wealth evaporated in a 2-year span. 7.5 trillion in losses in the portfolios and pension plans of everyday folk, 2 trillion in retirement plans and individual retirement accounts, IRAs, lost income, 1.9 trillion in traditional defined benefit plan losses, and lastly, 3.6 trillion in non-pension asset losses. Moreover, this was all while 30 million Americans lost their jobs. All in all, subsidies and interventionist monetary policy played a large part in the loss of 65 trillion, not including the 13 trillion in taxpayer-funded bailouts. Some may justify this by saying, yes, 13 trillion is expensive, but it was to save us, the consumer. Although this is one potential viewpoint, I'm inclined to agree with Dr. Prinz when she remarked, I don't think the financial sector bailout has ever been about fixing the problem. It's been about using the crisis as a pretext for the greatest transfer of public wealth into private hands in monetary history. I mean, these are just astounding numbers.
Oh, that's staggering.
And most of those numbers are not talked about. Most of us just talk about the 700 billion for TARP.
Well, and the thing that I think is just like, there's a number that really, really stood out to me, which is the fact that all of this, so $65 trillion of capital was basically destroyed in terms of losses and $13 trillion in taxpayer-funded bailouts. So you're looking at like $78 trillion, which is what you just mentioned there. Now, what is interesting is what triggered all of this the great financial crisis? Well, it was 5.1 million foreclosed properties that were kind of like backed by subprime loans. If you actually just total up the value of all of those 5.1 million properties and those subprime loans, it equals $1.4 trillion. So you could have bailed out the economy instead of 70. Now, I'm not pro bailouts. I think it should have wiped clean. But if the government really cared about the populace, you could have bailed out every single subprime loan for $1.4 trillion, but instead you created $78 trillion of losses. And then you see companies like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley basically receive $10 billion of bailout money each after they lose $27 billion. You see Merrill Lynch receive $10 billion, and it still paid out $3.6 billion in bonuses in the same year. So like this is just like immense capital destruction as a result of intervention. And I don't think people ever look at the numbers. They just think, well, it's needed because otherwise the economy would collapse. Instead, it's just this huge transition of wealth from the lower class to the upper class.
Yeah, and so just touching on subsidies here in general, and we'll gloss through a bit of this, but farming subsidies, as Callie Means, the former Coca-Cola consultant turned whistleblower, says, are we as a society, when close to 80% of Americans are overweight or obese, going to ask why people are getting so fat why people are getting so sick, why people are getting so depressed, all at the same time. Housing subsidies. I mean, all these things distort economic signals. But one of them, that we haven't touched on really is propaganda and, the silencing of opposition. So maybe how does this, all these subsidies kind of affect that?
So I think, and I'll give, like, there's many examples globally, and I'm sure people are familiar with what is happening at the moment during the pandemic and whatnot, or what has happened since the pandemic and the amount of censorship we've seen. Even for me as an individual, just by me sharing some of my views, I saw my Twitter account shadow banned. So I noticed that sometimes I wouldn't get a single view on some of my posts. And I'm not like, I don't think I'm very controversial. I think that, yeah, I may not have mainstream beliefs, but I'm not overly controversial. I'm just trying to highlight what's happening in the world. And I've seen myself shadow banned. But in Canada, for instance, like we are seeing, you take CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Association, or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. CBC, they made, I think it was last year, $400 million in revenue. That's revenue. That's not net income. Revenue. They received $1 billion in basically taxpayer like capital to be able to operate. Like, this is a company that should not exist. This company shows in a free market that it is not able to use its capital productively and make money. And yet it is still around and it's being supported by taxpayers. Now, what ends up happening is CBC is one of the biggest media corporations in Canada. I think it may even be the biggest media corporation in Canada. So when the government is directing capital towards these media corporations, it is governing what is being said. So you're seeing these major media corporations basically as a mouthpiece for government. They're suppressing information which otherwise would make it into media because they're controlling the cash flow. They're controlling who gets paid. And it's the same thing with journalists. In Canada, there's a journalism tax incentive where I think you get something like $35,000 in basically benefits if you are a journalist, but you have to be an approved, trusted journalist. So that basically means that you can't just be any journalist. If you're saying anything that opposes the government, you're no longer you're no longer able to access that benefit. So that is huge. You're incentivizing journalists to say one thing and not another. And so this is where I start to see when the government has control of the money printer, it can start directing money to controlling the narrative. And that is when I find it really scary, because ultimately you're not actually allowing freedom of speech. You're not actually allowing the fringe population that tend to change always arises in the fringe. It doesn't arise in the mainstream. You're not allowing the fringe population to actually speak up and highlight what their thoughts are. And so most Bitcoiners tend to agree that one of the most important pieces of society is free speech. Because if we do not have free speech, then controlling structures can ultimately govern how people see and how people perceive the world around us. And so I very much disagree with where central banking and the fact that when the government controls the money printer, it can ultimately direct capital to where it sees fit, which includes directing capital towards media corporations and controlling the narrative.
Oh my, you don't have to tell me. My last show, the one before this with Jeffrey A. Tucker, The World is on Fire, was taken down after 24 hours on YouTube for misinformation. Apparently, you are not allowed to disagree with the World Health Organization or local authorities. They are the arbiter of truth. And, I mean, this is my passion project. I don't make a lot of money from YouTube, but, I was building an audience there, and it's alarming. And now I don't want to build on YouTube anymore because it's going to be taken away from me. To get my channel back, I had to go through training, mind control training, to tell me how to think and understand their policies. The questions in the mind control training were so Orwellian and so on point for what is controversial or considered conspiratorial today, around, you can say certain things around the vaccines or around COVID or around diseases. You can make assertions based on your own experience, but you can't say, this thing causes ill effects, or you can only say what's maybe happened to you. Or, I mean, I'm going through the training now. I wanted to get the screenshots for prosperity's sake, to see what I had to do to get my channel back. And now I'm on the 3-strike warning program. So they're sealing their own fate. I don't know why any Bitcoiner or anybody who wants sovereignty or independence or control of their content would build there.
Well, and it goes back to, I've forgotten the Bitcoiner that said, it may have, I'm trying to remember who it was. They mentioned something like, we are told financial advice, we're told what we can and can't invest in because it's for our own good, from someone who is $33 trillion in debt, not including unfunded liabilities. And it's the same thing with all of this misinformation, disinformation. We're being told what we can and can't think and what is truthful from people that have constantly lied to us, that have constantly kind of misrepresented the truth to benefit themselves. And it's just like, ultimately, I think that if we had a transparent government, we wouldn't have the same issues with conspiracy theories and whatnot, because the reason why conspiracy theories arise is because we don't have a transparent government. We don't have a government that's actually willing to kind of share what it's actually done, what it's actually been through, why it made certain decisions. And so ultimately, I believe in free speech and I believe in transparency. The government shouldn't know more about us than we know about the government.
I agree there. And, kind of like maybe wrap up a little bit on the subsidies portion, or just, sort of money's, maybe turning our attention to sort of money's toll on our planet. I read your book alongside Saif Fadin Amousa's book. And sometimes in your life, when you do that, you tend to equate books or have a conversation between the books. So there's sort of one detail that I think Saif kind of divulges from your line of thinking here on the scarcity of resources, and more aligns it to sort of scarcity of human time. But you bring up really interesting and astounding, examples of, regardless of whether you think, certain resources might be scarce, or whether we just have a hard time, extricating them, or getting our time or energy pointed towards those things. We are fucking things up in a lot of bad ways. So, because Safe kind of takes the approach that resources are kind of infinite from a human perspective, where if all the resources on the planet were a swimming pool, like an Olympic-sized swimming pool, what humans have actually kind of gotten to might be like half a cup. And we haven't gotten to all the gold or all the ore or the iron or whatever we could. But we can destroy, I think, our environment in different ways, not just by sort of depleting resources, but sort of ruining things. I'd love to ask you kind of what you've seen. I mean, this example with the Soviets' plan for Central Asia was astonishing, and the other one about China's intervention in the mid 2000s. So what have you seen there with sort of, where maybe it's misallocation of capital and in the environment?
So this is where I think it's so fascinating. First off, I think it's really important to separate climate change from environmental destruction, because they're two very different things. And I think a lot of people conflate the two of them. And so what I'm talking about here is environmental destruction, because I think we're very much seeing a lot of devastation, whether it's of our natural forests, whether it's through mining, whether it's through consumption of like resources and whatnot. Climate change, I think, is a whole different story and a very controversial subject, but I think our climate has been changing throughout history, and I think it's important to be able to separate fact from fiction. But going back to kind of our planet, when it comes to environmental destruction, we just need to look at going back to GDP growth. GDP, 68% of all transactions are consumption transactions, which basically means that when the government is targeting, or when the central bank is targeting, let's say a 2 to 3% GDP growth year over year, what they're really saying is we need constantly increase in consumption. Now, this doesn't align with trying to like kind of protect our planet for resources. This is that we're constantly trying to pillage more and more and more of our natural resources because our money is worth less. We're incentivized to consume, and the government wants to consume because it wants to keep growing GDP growth. And so first off, that's the first thing that we're seeing happening. People are basically constantly trying to pillage all they can from the environment to get what they can. Now, the next thing is what you start to see with intervention is when the government steps in and intervenes with resources, whether that is suppressing prices, whether that's creating artificial demand and whatnot, you're actually starting to see, like, let's say suppressing prices. If oil prices start to rise, which we've seen in Europe, especially with Russia and Ukraine and the issues that we've seen there, when oil prices start to rise and the government steps in and suppresses those prices because they think that, oh, it's going to be hard on the economy, what they're actually doing is now, if the prices had risen, at some point, people wouldn't be able to afford that oil, which then reduces demand. Instead, by suppressing prices, you've now allowed people to purchase oil, which otherwise would not have been able to purchase oil. So you've created all this artificial demand, which means greater resource extraction. And greater resource extraction means more environmental destruction. And the analogy, well, the example I give in the book is called the Aral or the Aral Sea. I don't quite know how to pronounce it, but it was basically looking at, say, Stalin. And during Stalin era, they realized they needed cotton, and they needed cotton quickly. And so the Aral Sea, which was one of the biggest lakes in the world at the time, or it's one of the biggest kind of inland seas in the world, they basically started to create cotton farms around the sea. But this wasn't natural demand. This is artificial demand, because this demand wasn't being created because people wanted cotton. It's because the government thought that they needed cotton and they wanted to create more products for society. It's central planning at its best. And so all of a sudden they created all these artificial cotton farms. And basically throughout the next kind of handful of decades, you saw the sea slowly shrink in size as you consumed more and more of those of the water from that sea to move towards cotton farming. And now that sea is something like 2 or 3% of its original size. It's basically lost a large majority of its volume. And that was created because of artificial demand. Basically, a central planner came in and said, we think we need this. We're going to step in and create this artificial supply, and we're going to sell it to people. We're going to subsidize it. In a free market situation, that would never have happened. If there was not demand for that product, then naturally we would not have seen those cotton farms survive, because they wouldn't have been able to survive because they wouldn't have had subsidies. And so again, what ends up happening when the government steps in, whether it's through trying to artificially create GDP growth, when the government steps in suppressing prices, when the government steps in by creating artificial demand, by creating cotton plantations that there's no demand for, all of a sudden we start impacting our planet in a way that we otherwise wouldn't have in a free market situation. And you can also see as well, when the government steps in and starts to suppress interest rates, we start to see supply chain expansion, because naturally companies, because capital is more freely available, they start to look further abroad. And a perfect example of this is, I used to work for this mountain bike manufacturer, and we used to make handlebars, we used to make steel hardtail frames and whatnot. And we used to have this competitor that used to make carbon handlebars here in Vancouver. And they ended up at one point, it was cheaper for them to go, after they'd made the carbon handlebar, to go get the decal put on in China and shipped back to Canada than it was to get the decal put on in Vancouver. And this is where it's just like artificial capital from suppressed interest rates naturally increases supply chains. And so today, the average product, when it lands on our door, touches 6 countries before it lands, before we basically touch it, this is artificial supply chains. And on top of that, this kind of globalization, these artificial supply chains, they increase fragility immensely. You just look at COVID, and all of a sudden, when one area of the supply chain starts to break down, when shipping starts to break down, all of a sudden, economies can cease functioning because they don't have food, they don't have goods, they don't have whatever it may be. And so I tend to think when we are, then the toll on the planet, one second, I'll just make that kind of point, which is when we have these artificial supply chains, all of a sudden we're moving these products across the ocean, we're moving these products in planes. Think about all of the resources, the oil, whatnot, that's being consumed that naturally would not be consumed if a lot of that supply was domestic. A lot of that supply was from a free market system as opposed to an artificial system. So in the end, our money creates a massive excess burden on our environment because it creates a bunch of artificial demand.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I want to read a little bit more from your piece, just to expand on what happened in the Aral Sea. So although cotton had previously been cultivated in Central Asia beginning in 1959, the Soviets' plan for cotton cultivation were a departure from previous practices. The Aral Sea region was selected for its ideal conditions: 2 large rivers that could provide ample water to support the intensive farming of the crop. A little over 20 years later, it seemed like the plan was successful. Cotton output reached 9 million tons, making Central Asia the 4th largest cotton producer in the world. However, as subsidies suppressed prices and cotton demand continued to grow, the lake eventually couldn't handle the unnatural water demand from cotton cultivation, and cracks began to show. As the Aral's water volume started to drop from overuse, fertilizers and pesticide concentrations meant the water became poisonous for fish and animal populations, not to mention people. And cotton harvests began to decline due to the increased soil salinity surrounding the sea. The once thriving fishing and canning industry evaporated, replaced by anemia, high infant and maternal mortality, and debilitating respiratory and intestinal ailments. And illnesses, starvation, and poverty now plagued the region. The 3.5 million people in and around the region witnessed their health, jobs, and living conditions literally go down the drain. And to top it all off, without the moderating influence of a large body of water, the seasons of Central Asia have become much more extreme. Summers, which were already scorching, became much hotter, drier, and longer, and winters even colder, icier, and drier.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Artificial agricultural expansion through subsidies doesn't just impact the local communities and environment, but also the surrounding continental climate. It's kind of interesting how we can kind of change our conditions, and that's very frustrating because maybe even some people who were local there kind of can see this happening and can see policy and the way things are going, and it's like watching a slow moving train wreck. It's what happened in China that they intervened, and it doesn't always unfold as expected. Around the mid 2000s, the Chinese government subscribed to the adage, "If you build it, they will come," and relied on low interest rates to spur an artificial economic growth. Thanks to the suppressed cost of capital, property developers overbuilt far beyond what the market could absorb, wasting immense quantities of resources. By 2010, some 65 million properties connected to the power grid were not using any electricity, and estimates suggested that 20% of urban dwellings were unoccupied. That is enough property to house the population of Canada twice over. Obviously, you can't move dwellings, and they wouldn't have had those resources maybe in Canada or the political will to subsidize them. But it's astonishing what humans can do when they put our minds to it. But it's also astonishing that we could put our minds to such ill-fated endeavors.
Mhm.
But the next chapter of the book was probably the most surprising to me. And it's about the hypnotic trance of mass formation and how controlling structures use psychology to command change from the totalitarian point of view. What are you seeing in terms of, well, what is mass formation, and is it the same as mob mentality?
For sure. No, and I would say this is one of those chapters where I was like, oh man, do I talk about this? This is maybe a little more controversial, but it's looking at mass formation is basically when you have, exactly to your point, this kind of mob mentality, when you have a large formation of the population that basically live blindly and are willing to kind of enact whatever they're being told. And it leads to very dark times throughout history. When you start looking at many of the authoritarian, many of the totalitarian environments we've seen throughout history, whether we're talking about Kim Il-sung, whether we're talking about from North Korea, whether we're talking about Mao Zedong in China, whether we're talking about Stalin, Hitler, a lot of these mass formations, people blindly following these people in power, I believe these stem from our monetary system. And the reason why is when we start to see an economy that is trying to target perpetual growth because it is debt-based, when you've got so much debt overhanging the economy, it has to continually grow and grow and grow. But as you're constantly growing and technology is declining and prices should be falling, you start to see breakdowns in society. You start to see recessions, you start to see depressions, you start to see major corporations starting to fail. So as you start to see these economic challenges, the government has to intervene. It can't let society collapse given how much debt it's got. And so it intervenes increasingly. You start to see more and more financial manipulation, all in an attempt to avert collapse. And what that leads to is more and more controlling structures. The government continually has to take away certain rights and freedoms to stop certain behaviors. So in China, you start to see capital controls. You still start to prevent money from fleeing overseas. You start to see censorship of speech, like we've been talking about. You start to see the censorship of so-called misinformation, disinformation. These are all to try and stop basically society from collapsing, because ultimately we're not seeing what is actually happening. We're not seeing the true economic conditions because of this intervention. And so ultimately what ends up happening is, because society is unable to see what is happening, we start to see these rising rates of meaninglessness. We start to see these rising rates of depression, and people are looking for a reason. And so one book that truly made a big difference in kind of how I see the world is this guy called Matthias Desmet. And he kind of became famous during the pandemic because he is a professor of psychology in Ghent University, and he's kind of the foremost leader in kind of totalitarian and controlling structures. And so he wrote this book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And he believes that there are kind of four main steps that lead to totalitarianism. And those are, first off, you need a society that is lonely. Well, how does that happen? If people are earning less, if people have to work more, then they're not spending time with their peers. If people are earning less and they're not spending time with their peers, naturally loneliness starts to set in. And then condition two, meaninglessness. And we've already talked about this. If our money is not going as far as it once did, if it's harder and harder to get by to buy a house, meaninglessness starts to set in. We're not reaping what we sow. That leads to condition three, widespread free-floating anxiety. Now, there's a difference between anxiety and free-floating anxiety. Anxiety is when you can attach it to something. If, for instance, let's say my partner is ending a relationship with me, you can attach it, well, I have anxiety because my partner is ending my relationship, or our relationship. Free-floating anxiety is when I feel this sense of dread, I feel this sense of anxiety, but I don't know why I'm feeling this. And when you've got a society where our social connections are breaking down, when we're finding meaninglessness and we can't attach it to why this is happening, you get in this widespread sense of kind of anxiety. And then condition four, aggression and frustration. When people are feeling anxious, when people are meaninglessness, when people are lonely, naturally they want an outlet. So they start to get aggressive. They start to get frustrated. And what Professor Desmet says is that basically under these circumstances, if a government comes up with a story and they say why this is happening, people naturally, they believe this why, they can attach this kind of this object of anxiety, and the government can now kind of direct its energy, and the populace can direct its energy towards creating change. That doesn't mean that change is right. That doesn't mean that what they're doing is right. And when you look back throughout history, you just need to see Hitler and the Jewish population. He targeted the Jewish population. You just need to look at Stalin, and you look at a lot of the farmers and whatnot. You look at Mao, and Mao targeted a lot of the intellectuals in society. And he managed to get these huge formations of the population to basically believe that these people are the reason why they're feeling the pain in society. These people are the reason why they're feeling stress and why it's harder to get by. And in reality, got nothing to do with that. The reason why they're feeling these things is because society is breaking down. And so those four conditions, I wanted to, in the book, add one more condition, which I believe is the first condition in all of those. Before you can get loneliness, before you get meaningless, before you get free-floating anxiety and aggression and frustration, I believe you need a misaligned or co-opted monetary system. Because if you have an aligned monetary system where people are reaping what they sow, where people are actually, their purchasing power is increasing over time, where people are able to save, it is a lot harder to find that loneliness, that meaninglessness and whatnot. And so I wanted to add to kind of Mateus's approach and add this condition zero or condition one, which is that misaligned co-opted monetary system. So I would say one of the founding pillars of authoritarianism, one of the founding pillars of totalitarian environments, stems from a broken monetary system. Because ultimately, as society starts breaking down, the government intervenes more. And as the government intervenes more, it increasingly has to try, and it's playing whack-a-mole with all these byproducts in society that are popping up because it is intervening monetarily. And so it's trying to make decisions on a system which it doesn't really understand. It's not getting true economic signals, because going back to the four stages of economic kind of breakdown, we can't see what's actually of value in society. We can't see the companies that are actually offering value. We can't see where capital naturally flows in society because we've suppressed it through intervention. So mass formation, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, I think all of these things stem from initially, well, kind of one of the major factors is a broken monetary system.
What would be the appeal of mass formation then?
So it's a tough one, because ultimately, if you look at these controlling structures, whether it's the government, whether it's a leader, a totalitarian leader or whatnot, if you want to create change in society, you have to create mass formation. Because if you think about any leader, a leader is such a small minority in a population. So you have to you have to get your population on side with you in order to be able to implement change. And so when you create a mass formation, when, like we've seen through the pandemic, people willingly give up their rights. People willingly shed their freedoms because they're supposedly doing something better for the collective. So people give up their autonomy because ultimately, if you've attached this object of anxiety and you've said, this is why this is happening to you, regardless of whether or not it's true, But ultimately, then people feel a sense of, okay, we need to fight back against these individuals. With Hitler, it was the Jewish population. So you suddenly start attacking this population and giving up your rights and freedoms because you're doing something better for the collective, but it's very misguided. It's not allowing the free market to take place. It's not allowing freedom of speech and people to actually stand up and say what is right. And the problem with mass formation, and as we saw during the pandemic, is when you start to have this huge consensus in beliefs, as an individual who doesn't believe in that consensus, it's very hard to stand up and say your opinion because you get slandered, you get suppressed in the media, you get basically put down. And for me personally, I'm unvaccinated and I was fired from 2 jobs just because of my beliefs. And I have nothing against, if someone wants to go get vaccinated, go and do that. No problem at all. But I believe that everyone should be able to have bodily autonomy and a choice. And people should not be criticized for a belief that they're held. And this is where I think in society, when you have these large consensus beliefs, you impede people actually rising up and creating opposing beliefs. But it's only through opposing beliefs that we can actually create change in science, create change in innovation, because you need that opposition. You need that person to push back in order to create that change.
Do you think we're in mass formation now, or we have? Do you think our system is susceptible to it? Do you think we're in it now, or do you think we're going to face it?
You know what? I would say a year and a half ago, if we've had this conversation, I would have said we were much more heavily in a position of mass formation, given that I think we had a much higher consensus viewpoint. But I think that the problem with any form of, well, actually, I wouldn't say it's a problem. I think it's great. Any totalitarian environment eventually destroys itself. Because when people are feeling this widespread sense of anxiety, when they're feeling this aggression and frustration, they constantly need a new object to basically have this outlet of aggression and frustration. But when they realize that that object actually was not the cause, that object wasn't what actually created this anxiety, then they go on to the next one and they go on to the next one. And so if you look at, say, Stalin constantly needed to find new objects that were creating anxiety. So he started breaking down the Catholics. He started breaking down the farming institutions. He started breaking down the individuals that were free thinkers, the academics. And so you start to see society start to break down. And so eventually these totalitarian environments basically eat themselves from the inside out. And so mass formation doesn't last long term, but it can last for a long time. And people can be under the thumb of mass formation for a long time. And so where we are now, I'm starting to see that people are starting to question the mainstream narratives. Like we're even seeing like El Salvador, we're seeing Bitcoin being adopted as legal tender. We're seeing Bukele basically step in and kind of create change. What we've just seen in Argentina, we're seeing someone step in, Milei, stepping in and saying, we're going to start breaking down government. I think just this week, one of his first executive orders is to reduce government from 21 departments to 9 departments. This is freaking phenomenal. We're starting to see a lot of these controlling structures be kind of like disbanded. And so I do believe globally, people are fed up because they're realizing that these socialist regimes, these regimes where basically we give up a lot of our rights and freedoms for supposed ease of life, are not working. People are struggling. And these interventionistic approaches are not actually aiding the population. So I think people are starting to wake up. And I think, although I'm not willing to say we don't have any mass formation, because I think there are still some really core mainstream beliefs that may be misguided, I think that in the last year or so, there's definitely been a shift. And you can even see it in things like Bitcoin. There's a lot of mainstream beliefs around Bitcoin, like Bitcoin uses energy, Bitcoin is wasteful, Bitcoin doesn't provide any value, and all these. But in the last year, all of a sudden, you're starting to see some big entities talk about how actually maybe Bitcoin is beneficial for the energy grid. Maybe Bitcoin this and that. Maybe Bitcoin and this kind of, when this starts to happen, I'm starting to see alternate perspectives arise. And that kind of shows me that mass formation is breaking down a little bit, but there's still main consensus beliefs. I don't know what your thoughts are, Cedric.
Well, I want to ask, and I think about maybe during COVID, people in power put in rules, and one of those rules might be, you can't visit someone in the hospital, or only one visitor at a time, something like this. And I think those could be very cruel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the main underpinning questions I have for you around this work is, how can you asked the question? So I'm reading your question, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the same question I have. How can some individuals in positions of power perpetrate such heinous acts or inflict suffering upon others? And where do you think effective parenting, plays into that, and could it prevent things like that?
So this is one thing that I think is just so fascinating. And I would say money is a huge, huge component. And given that we know that money is impacting parenting, I would kind of say that many of these leaders who are in positions of power, these people that are kind of propagating these kind of controlling narratives, many times they're actually just unconsciously reenacting their own childhood traumas. So you look at, say, the UK and a lot of these politicians. These politicians, a large majority of them went to boarding schools. A large majority of them never saw their parents. And ultimately, they didn't know whether or not their parents loved them. They didn't feel supported by their parents. Can you imagine being a 13-year-old and being kicked out of the house and shoved in a room full of boys, these huge dorms, and only seeing your parents a couple times a year? Like, what does that tell them? So that triggers immense trauma. They don't have that unconditional love. And so many times, I believe these people in positions of powers, and you just need to look at Mao, you just need to look at Stalin, Hitler, even Trudeau to a certain extent. I think they're striving to kind of pass on the suffering that they were unsupported with in their youth, that they were not able to navigate and their parents were not supporting them in. And so this is where I think if we are able to alleviate a lot of the monetary stress we find in society, if we're able to basically create a society where our purchasing power is at least staying still or increasing over time, like in Bitcoin was kind of world reserve currency or whatnot, I think parents would have a lot more time on their hands to support their children. That's not saying that's going to fix everything and everything's going to be hunky dory. But what it is saying is that I think there's a much lower probability of having these people that are incredibly traumatized leading nations. These people that they don't know themselves, let alone their populace. And many times they're just passing on their own suffering onto their population. And so I do believe that a lot of leaders these days, a lot of them have faced immense trauma as a child. And we as the populace are just facing the other end of that stick.
I think that's the hardest one for me to wrestle with. I wonder though if good people were to, have the growth mindset and had good parenting, strong internal locus of control, and said, "Hey, I'm not going to do this." I think in the times we're on, someone else would easily replace them. So the impact on society might be negligible,
For sure.
but I wish there were more people who were willing to go against the grain, think critically, and if they don't agree with what's happening, take themselves out of the equation, maybe.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think, to be 100% honest, in this environment that we're in right now, it actually doesn't matter if you're voting Republican, Democrat, conservative, Labor, right, left. Like, basically, the political affiliations pale in comparison to the systemic incentives that we find it from our current system. And so I think that people are constantly incentivized to intervene, use that money printer. And so we're not actually creating change. It doesn't really matter who is in power because they're kind of stuck with these certain systems. And that's where I think until we actually change the system, until we actually remove money from state and we actually realign the incentives to kind of adding value, I don't think that's going to change. And I think that if you were to remove money from state, you completely flip those incentives on their head. Because if you think about it, if you're a politician and you're not offering value to society, then another one is going to rise up which does offer value. Because you cannot just constantly rely on your balance sheet and constantly running deficits. You have to balance your books. You have to think about value creation. And so I think that altering our monetary environment flips on its head how we see the world, and it puts somewhat of a barrier to allowing a lot of these kind of controlling structures to emerge. That's kind of my personal belief.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that the next chapter is around the illusion of freedom, how unsustainable systems erode our rights and freedoms. And we've kind of covered how maybe Silicon Valley and social media are sort of a modern day totalitarianism. And you mentioned the war on drugs, AML, KYC, the war on terrorism, and how all these things infringe on our rights. The great financial crisis and even a lot of the regulations that came out of that. We all know how the pandemic has changed our lives and infringed on our rights. Or I don't know if we have to go down that rabbit hole in this episode. My episode was removed from Jeffrey Tucker from YouTube. We saw it with the Canadian truckers. We could talk about the Nuremberg Code and the vaccines. We talked about climate change. But on the food front, there were a few notable instances that you mentioned in your work in the book. And I want to talk about. I want to mention the Sri Lanka one. So Sri Lanka, and this is quoting you, Sri Lanka has relied on foreign fertilizers and pesticides in their farming practices for many decades. However, to meet ESG standards, the Sri Lankan government decided to push an organic farming action plan. While this initiative may seem promising, one of the first action steps was a ban on fertilizers and pesticides, which around 90% of farmers depend on. As a result, crop yields have plummeted and prices have soared. In 2021 alone, the cost of food rose by 33%, placing a significant burden on consumers. Meanwhile, 85% of farmers expected reductions in their harvest, with over half fearing declines of up to 40%. I mean, it's just really astonishing with the central planning and when people meddle. But what really blew me away was the Bank of International Settlements. And maybe sort of the shrouded in secrecy that this entity is in. Maybe you could touch upon what you saw with the Bank of. I mean, I just call this eyes wide shut. This is crazy.
Oh man, it's mind blowing. And I wanted to add one more little point just to kind of a couple of those points you made, which is I'd mentioned when we're talking about mass formation, many times these controlling structures, they tend to try and create an object to attach why we're feeling this anxiety. And so, as I mentioned, like Stalin, it was the West and capitalism and whatnot. And for Hitler, it was Jewish population. And Kim Jong-un, that was kind of the United States, and Christianity even had it as the printing press. And when we look back throughout history, you look at like the war on drugs, the war on terror, the great financial crisis, the pandemic, climate change, all of these things. Now, I'm not saying that there's no basis behind any of these things, but many times these narratives are used as a way to basically slowly remove rights and freedoms. And you can see every single one of them, we have experienced a slow decline in our rights and freedoms. We've seen kind of the war on drugs and whatnot. We've seen massive increased banking regulations and whatnot. But from the war on terror, we saw the rise of the surveillance state from the US Patriot Act. From the great financial crisis, we saw Barack Obama signing the Dodd-Frank Act, which basically gave big banks far more control, gave the US government far more control. The pandemic, we've started to see a lot of these kind of like overbearing regulations put in place, like you have to get vaccinated and breaking up personal autonomy. And so when we start to see this stuff, like if you actually just look over time, all we're basically seeing is surveillance is now the norm. We're seeing increased censorship, regulatory hurdles basically completely impede our ability to allocate capital where we want to allocate it. And it's even worse depending on which countries you're in. Like we're seeing world leaders ruling by force. Like Trudeau, I think during the pandemic, ruled by executive order. They didn't really have any kind of like Congress meetings for it was something like a year. He ruled by basically just like executive order. And then we're seeing regulatory creep leading to the monitoring of all our financial transactions. We're seeing constant monetary and fiscal intervention. And so you can start to see all of these events that have happened through history have basically slowly impeded in our ability to kind of like live freely. And as Churchill once said, I think it is, he says, like, never let a good crisis go to waste. Like the government always tried to capitalize off these crises. And so that kind of like leads us to kind of that question that you're talking about, the Bank of International Settlements. And so one of the chapters chapter 12, I kind of discuss these unelected organizations, such as like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements. And there's so many more as well. You've got the World Health Organization, which I don't discuss. But all of these institutions, they're basically totally unelected. They are usually put in power by whether it's the US who governs a lot of these institutions, they're kind of friends, corporations and whatnot that basically have control and oversight over these institutions. And these institutions have so much control. And so the Bank of International Settlements, and I speak a lot more deeply in the book, so I don't want to bore you guys too much on the podcast, but basically it's kind of deemed the central bank of central banks. Many central banks globally, their policies are basically handed down from the Bank of International Settlements. And the Bank of International Settlements is totally obscured. It's got no transparency. And so these individuals that basically govern this bank or the central bank of sorts, we don't know what they're talking about behind closed doors. We don't get to see any of their kind of policies. We only feel the brunt of it on the back end after the central banks have initiated change. And a lot of these individuals as well, they have total immunity. They're getting paid enormous sums. They don't have to have any transparency in terms of what it is that they talk about. And so this is where I just think, like, in a world, I believe that especially if we live underneath democratic principles at the moment, although I would say, is the system the best system? Given that we live underneath these democratic principles, I believe that people in power that are basically having control over our lives should at least be voted into power. And those individuals should not be behind these kind of these kind of black veils of anonymity. And so I think it's so important for us to be able to gain more clarity around how these institutions are governing our lives, because I think that we don't realize the extent at which they control. We don't realize the extent at which they kind of influence our lives. And one of the examples I think I give in the book, and I don't know the facts off the top of my head, so you should definitely check out the book, but it talks about how, like, during World War II with Hitler, what ended up happening is the Bank of International Settlements stepped in, and Czechoslovakia basically was holding a bunch of gold, a ton of gold. And Hitler basically just went to the Bank of International Settlements and basically just said, look, I want you to transfer gold from Czechoslovakia into our own, the Reichsbank, the German account, and they did no problem. And so you're starting to see, like, this Bank of International Settlements has an agenda. It sides with certain countries, yet it is so incredibly powerful. And so ultimately it compares countries against one another. It doesn't necessarily look at the world from an objective point of view. It looks at it very subjectively. And I think it's important to be able to recognize the influence at which it has.
I mean, this is kind of freaky. I want to read this. So the Bank for International Settlements was established by an international treaty in 1930 and has been granted significant legal protections under a 1987 headquarters agreement with the Swiss government. These protections are similar to those granted to the headquarters of other international organizations, such as the United States and the International Monetary Fund, as well as diplomatic embassies. As a result, the BIS is exempt from Swiss taxes, and the authorities require the permission of the BIS to enter the bank's premises. That's kind of fucked up. And it's not just that the BIS that benefits from these legal protections. Its employees do not have to pay income tax, and their salaries paid by the taxpayer are far from inconsequential. In 2011, the general manager earned the equivalent of $825,000 in Swiss francs, while department heads were paid $634,000 plus allowances. The BIS's legal privileges also extend to its staff and directors, who are granted special status similar to that of diplomats. For example, BIS officials have lifelong immunity under Swiss law for acts carried out during the service of their duties, and their bags cannot be searched during work-related travel. Every month, I didn't realize this, every month these guys meet. I didn't know how coordinated this is. The members of the BIS convene to discuss crucial topics concerning the global financial system, payment systems, and international markets, and all the members present are guaranteed complete confidentiality, discretion, and the highest levels of security. As Labor notes, as far back as 1930, the Bank for International Settlements has been known for its strict culture of secrecy. A New York Times reporter was once denied entry to the BIS boardroom even after the directors have left. Unfortunately, within the first decade of its existence, as you mentioned, the BIS had already given the world reason for pause when, they kind of helped the Nazis annex Czechoslovakia. This is only possible given that the BIS has immunity and their assets remain untouchable under international treaty.
Well, yeah, I was just going to add, that's a really, really good point, which is Argentina basically defaulted at one point. And what it did, it moved its funds to the Bank of International Settlements because the Bank of International Settlements had complete immunity. And so it was basically able to hide its funds in the Bank of International Settlements so that it didn't have to pay creditors. And so this is where it's just like countries that have mismanaged funds, misallocated funds, are using the Bank of International Settlements as a safe haven to hide capital so that it doesn't have to pay creditors. Like, this is just heinous. Like, this is someone who's supposedly governing our central banks, and I think they've just got zero oversight.
Well, this sounds way more nefarious, though. We can't check their bags. We can't go into the room. We can't ask to just show up like you could do it at any other sort of legal entity under the auspices of municipal law. I'm not trying to, argue for state intervention, but this is an ostensibly a state central planning organization, and the state has no access to them. And it's really, I don't even know how to kind of approach that. I think we kind of, with the show, kind of understand maybe the benefits of moving to a different system with Bitcoin. But one of the aspects that I think you bring up in the books that I do want to kind of talk about is what you call proof of expression. And maybe you could kind of talk a little bit about what proof of expression is.
For sure. So as I mentioned, like money to me is just a medium of expression. And so like language, which is also another form of medium of expression, we can be censored. And so when I think about money, what I think about is we need a form of money like Bitcoin that basically allows us for proof of expression. We cannot be impeded in our ability to send money to where we see fit. Because what that means is, first off, you're allowing capital to flow to where you deem is offering value in society, whatever that might be. You may disagree with what someone else sees as valuable, but that doesn't matter. If someone is directing capital towards that thing, that means that they see value in it. It kind of goes to the argument with Bitcoin. When people say, well, Bitcoin is worthless, Bitcoin is backed by nothing. It's just like, you know what? Bitcoin is not worthless, because if it was worthless, it'd be trading at zero. And yet it is trading at whatever it is, 41,000 US dollars right now, or something around there. And so what you realize is that if people are willing to direct capital towards something, it highlights that that thing, that entity, that service offers value. And so when I talk about proof of expression, I think that we need a monetary system that allows people to direct capital to where they see fit. That also means they don't direct capital to where they seem does not offer value in society. And so if that is a government, if that is a politician, or if that is a government that they deem is not offering value, then naturally that government will slowly falter and break down, and another one that does offer value will arise. And so this kind of brings us back to that kind of traditional Austrian approach, the Austrian economic approach, which is ultimately the free market is the best arbiter of truth. The free market allows us to compete with one another to be able to allow the victor, the one who offers the most value, to arise. If we kind of if we intervene and we prevent capital to flow to where we deem offers value, then all of a sudden we start distorting those signals in society. And so again, I think we need a monetary system that is built on proof of expression, because I think it is incredibly important. And on top of that, and this is kind of going back to the book 1984, in 1984 he talks about those who control the past control the future. And that is that if you can rewrite the past, then you can rewrite the future, because you change what people, how they perceive the world really is. And this is when we talk about Bitcoin, you cannot change past transactions. A transaction is immutable. It is written in like effectively stone in each one of these blocks. And so what I think is so fascinating is all of a sudden we have an accurate representation of all of the transactions that's happened through past. So we can see where value is flowing in society unimpeded. We don't have this obfuscation that we have in our current system. We can see where value is flowing in society, and that is true proof of expression.
And you go on to write, with Bitcoin offering a decentralized global record of truth, with no need for trust in third parties or permission to use, in the age of censorship, you could argue that Bitcoin is the ultimate evolutionary adaptation of free speech. Paraphrasing Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, history can be easily deleted or rewritten in the digital realm. And even without the intent to delete, undocumented history starts disappearing. Of what history remains, it is very much centralized in museums under lock and key. Those who control these historical records have the capacity to alter how history is portrayed. As George Orwell once said, he who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Historical monetary data and freedom of monetary expression are critical to ensuring that the past, present, and future cannot be altered through false narratives by centralized entities. Along those lines, how is Bitcoin the closest thing we have to a natural system?
So I would say when it comes to Bitcoin, because we have a decentralized ledger, that means no one person can control the ledger, who has money, who doesn't, where money flows to, where money doesn't. And naturally, going back to that proof of expression, it allows us to direct capital where we see fit. So in terms of a natural system, I just believe Bitcoin allows competition to take place. Bitcoin allows creative destruction to take place. Bitcoin allows people to direct capital where they see fit. And I think that is very much needed in order for us to be able to wipe clean a lot of this fiscal irresponsibility, a lot of this inefficient practices that we see in society. And going back to that example that Caitlin Long shared, like in 1920, we had a depression that was just as deep as the 1930 depression. We had a depression that saw the same amount of unemployment, but instead of it being, what was it? I think it took 25 years for the stock market to rebound to the same price at which it was pre-depression. Instead, it took 9 months. And that is because you allowed basically fiscal irresponsibility, you allowed unproductive capital to wipe clean, and you allowed these individuals that were offering value in society to rise up. And so this is where I just think ultimately we need to let natural market forces take place, and Bitcoin allows that in, I think, the best way possible out of any monetary system that I know of.
So then, this is obviously the most important question tonight. What do you think of dinks? And,
Is
I
it,
mean,
wait, is Dink the
double
Dink?
income, no kids.
That's, yeah. I think that, again, it goes back to when we have a society where we're just trying to get what we can, when we have a society where we have created, how should I word this? When we have a society whereby basically, because the cost of living is so high, kids are a huge burden. Traditionally, when we used to live rurally, for every kid we had an extra hand on the farm. We had an extra hand to help out. Today, we live in these societies whereby when you live in a city, all of a sudden, if you have 2, 3, 4 kids, you've got to start getting more rooms on your apartment, higher expenses. And so we're not incentivizing people to actually have kids. Not only that, many of the mainstream media is actually tarnishing people having kids. Like one of my relationships I was in for 5 years ended because I wanted to have kids and my partner didn't, because she felt that the world was breaking down, that if we have kids, we're kind of adding to this burdensome society and the world is overpopulated. And the reality is that I think that is very misguided. And additionally, for society to even be able to flourish, we need to be able to have the next generation. Otherwise, you have an aging population. And if you have an aging population with no workers, who supports the debt burden? Who supports this aging population? We're seeing this in Japan. We're seeing it in China. China is supposedly meant to see its population half by 2050. This is going to destroy our global economy. And so I think that ultimately, I think these dinks are misguided. And on top of that, I think that one of the most satisfying experiences in life, and this is from countless others, this is from the longest psychological study ever in history, is that relationships and children are some of the most rewarding things that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the belief that this is sort of an astroturfed campaign, that it's not organic, but even whatever it might be organic from it. I remember being in my 20s. I mean, inflation and our monetary system makes it hard to value the future and value starting a family, and you might have the economic ability to buy a home or support kids or a spouse, and so it's very difficult. And I think that's unfortunate that it's making people postpone family creation if they want to. And what I loved about this book is it really gets into the family unit, and you, to sum it up in a way, you kind of talk about how if there's reduced financial pressures, there's less adverse childhood experiences, which supports neurodevelopment in children, which helps social, emotional, cognitive development, which reduces the likelihood of adopting health and risky behaviors, which gives you greater resilience against diseases, debilities, and social problems. But I think around that reducing likelihood of adopting health and risky behaviors is if our children become leaders, they'll have a better maybe attitude towards culture and meaning and policy and the way they kind of try to lead society. I think the questions that your work tries to aim is, why do people feel voiceless today? Who am I? Or what are my needs and boundaries, and how I can explore my authentic self with curiosity, not a sense of shame. It's a tremendous piece of work. And, it was kind of the piece I was looking for just, in my time in my life, and trying to understand, how money, impacts the family unit. So I'll leave it to you for any parting words. and to let people know where they can find you and your work. And obviously I'll put a link to the book in the show notes and stuff like that.
Oh man, I really appreciate it, Cedric, and I really appreciate you just having me on. I think that you create such phenomenal work, and I think you've just got such a way with your questions that it's been such a pleasure. And you know what, I wanted to add one more little point when we're talking about Bitcoin, what I just think is truly, truly profound, and it kind of ties it back to what I mentioned at the start, which is where money loses its ability to store value, naturally we start to see a rise in property prices as people look to store value elsewhere. And what I just think is just so fascinating with Bitcoin is that it flips our whole world on its head. For instance, if we think about technology tends to be falling, prices should be falling around 5 to 15% per year. So if prices are falling at 5 to 15% per year, and then you look at, say, real estate, well, real estate annualizes usually around, I think it's something like 8% growth a year over the last 100 years. Equities are around 9 to 10%, I believe, something around that. Bonds are around 5%. So if prices were falling at 5 to 15% per year, then simply saving in the currency, if Bitcoin was a world reserve currency, would outperform most traditional assets. So all of a sudden, all of this money would flow out of traditional assets like real estate back into the currency. Now, what does that mean? That means that properties would be a hell of a lot cheaper. Getting into farming would be so much more easy. A lot of this capital that is going towards unicorn companies would no longer exist. So we would see a lot more value creation in the companies that do exist. And so it flips all of this on its head. And I just think it is truly profound, some of the benefits that Bitcoin has to offer. And again, kind of tying things up, like I really appreciate this time, Cedric. And if people want to find me, you can reach out on Looking Glass Education. You can find me at Seb Bunny, which is Bunny, Bunney, on Twitter. And then I also just have a blog where I write about a lot of my thoughts, which kind of, I would say, is a culmination of what kind of my thoughts are, what made up this book. And I write about a lot of the stuff that's in this book. But yeah, you can find me at sebbunny.com. And if you want to kind of check out this book, it just released yesterday, and you can find it on Amazon, at your local Amazon. And at the moment, it's in paperback ebook. Hopefully I'll have audiobook soon. And yeah, again, I really appreciate the time, Cedric. It's been such a blast.
All right, then you have to tell us your blog. It's the Key of Money, QI.
The Chi of Self-Sovereignty.
The Chi of Self-Sovereignty.
QI, and that's kind of I initially came up with that name because the Chi of self-sovereignty, it's like the Chi Chi in Chinese terms is kind of that life force energy. And I see it as like the energy behind being more self-sovereign as an individual, the ability to be able to express ourselves, the energy behind being able to show up in this world how we want to rather than how we're told to. And so I talk a lot about whether it's money or whether it's psychology, whether it's parenting, whether or not it's politics, and how all of this weaves into being our authentic selves, because I think that it is so, so important.
Well, this has been so dope, Seb. I can't wait to get the physical copy. I've only read the PDF. I got 100 and something pages of notes here. We didn't even cover all of it, so I recommend people go out and get the book. Thank you so much. This has been so dope.
Thanks a lot, Cedric. Have an awesome rest of the week.
Hey, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast with deep critical thinker Seb Bunny. I hope that you found it as informative and enlightening as I did. Hit us up. We'd love to hear your feedback. I want to thank you for tuning in. Please keep in mind that I only work with the best sponsors and that they are a big reason I can deliver this content to you for free. So I hope that you will support them. Alpa for energy bars at eatalpa.com. Make sure to use the code MATRIX. River to build your Bitcoin wealth. Link in the show notes. Thea for multi-sig. That's super mobile friendly and secure. Hodler's Official for the dopest Team Bitcoin merch. Florida Beef Initiative for succulent grass-fed steaks. And you can also find me at the Bitcoin Advisor, where I'm a phone call away to help you with all your Bitcoin needs. Finally, if you could write a 5-star review for the Bitcoin Matrix podcast wherever you listen to your pods, that would really help spread the word and help new listeners find the show. Keep building, keep stacking, always stay laser focused out there, and let's work to find a way to free Ross. This is Cedric. Peace.